I'm gonna say something controversial, but I don't care.
Is your ego that fucking crazy that you think that you're better than Christ? That you think you're more enlightened than the Buddha?
But you just dropped a bomb there, and I want to push back a little bit against it because
that's also because I've participated in ritual where we don't have a holy Bible, the altar.
But I also want to ask you personally if you think the God of the Old Testament is a tyrant.
You know, I know that the conspiracy theorists will love that turn of phrase that I just used, but
what about when you're joining Freemasonry? You are tapping into an egregore as well.
So essentially, Jewish members, you know, Kabbalistically trained, heretical, you know, Jews, you know, eventually became involved in Freemasonry. And
Mike, you're not holding back.
They were all Masons. They were all Freemasons. And so by their Masonic obligation, they could not kill Napoleon.
Why are Freemasons everywhere on the internet right now? Some of them going viral. Who is Lucifer, and is Freemasonry Luciferian?
Well,
one of the last questions that I want to ask you is if you think that Jesus was actually the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
It's a good question.
Mike Samu, welcome to the Solve at Coagula podcast, and thank you for honoring my invitation.
The pleasure is mine. Glad to be here.
Before we get into the complex history of the symbols, I want to establish your personal background. Who are you? How did you discover Masonry? What specific rite do you practice? And what does this tradition mean to you personally? I'm really interested in that.
Yes. Again, thank you for having me. Well, again, my name is Michael Samu. I colloquially kind of go by the nickname Magic Mike. I am part of the Grand Lodge of California, which is free and accepted. So technically, I would say that would take the modern, you know, rite. So it's not ancient and accepted. So we don't include the Royal Arch to our degree system. That's something that you have to do after you receive the 3 degrees of the modern rite. And then I've also done the York Rite, the Scottish Rite. I was initiated into the SRICF, which is the Rosicrucian branch of Freemasonry. That's invitation only. And I'm also a member of the Southern California Research Lodge, which publishes one of the last remaining full-color, internationally distributed magazines on Freemasonry called the Fraternal Review. So I'm a contributor, and I've also been a co-editor for them for quite some time now, for the last 2 years, 3 years.
Perfect. That's interesting because I didn't know you are also studying Rosicrucian. Yes, this is a surprise. So I didn't plan to ask you about this, but I will later in the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what Masonic rite do you practice, and what degree you at currently?
I practice the free and accepted modern rite. So that would be just the first 3 degrees. So in Blue Lodge Masonry, I'm a master Mason, and then I hold an officership as the musician or organist, which is just because I play piano for the degrees. So I'm also an officer within the Blue Lodge, and again, this is just Grand Lodge of California, free and accepted. And yeah, that's where I'm at as far as Blue Lodge. I'm a master. I'm a most excellent master within the York Rite system, and which is essentially the York Rite, or excuse me, the Royal Arch degrees, the Cryptic Council, and I haven't done the Commandery, which is the Knights Templar and stuff yet. So I haven't fully completed the York Rite system, but I've made it in for the first 2, and then I'm also a 32nd degree in the Scottish Rite out of South Pasadena.
Okay, that's what I was curious about because you had it in your bio, so I wanted to clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
so technically 32nd degree, but again, these are things where, you know, these are just add-ons. So I know a lot of people place a lot of emphasis because of conspiracy theories and things like that, and just the way that the internet, the internet community, they put a huge emphasis on the 32nd degree, but really the only thing that matters in Freemasonry is the 3 degrees of the Blue Lodge. So
that's gonna be controversial, I think, for some Freemasons, but It's an interesting take, and some I think a lot of people will agree with you on that one, especially in my community. Now, the term Masonic rite gets used often in esoteric circles, but it is rarely explained well. Could you define what a rite actually is? Furthermore, many outsiders are completely unaware of the arcane layers present in these rituals. Can you speak to the magical, alchemical, gnostic, and perhaps theurgical elements woven into Masonic practice?
Absolutely. Well, for us, because everything within Masonry is jurisdictional, so that's like one thing
Mhm.
that if that non-Masons have to always kind of consider is that, um, essentially is like that different jurisdictions have different rules. Different Grand Lodges will consider others regular, and they will accept them as actual brothers, whereas other lineages and other groups are considered clandestine or irregular. So these are things that are very, very political within that sphere that you have to hash out for yourself. As far as the Masonic Rite itself, again, in Grand Lodge of California and most American Freemasonry, we place an emphasis on the first 3 degrees, which is, just entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. So each of those 3 stages obviously have represent essentially some kind of like alchemical stage, arguably, if you don't do like 7-day and you just reduce it down to the 3 stages, the 3 primary stages of alchemy, that's essentially what's going on within these degrees. There's some people who argue about like which degrees correspond to which stages and that they potentially could be like not in the right order, but that's all again like something that has to be debated amongst esoteric Masons. But it's but yeah, there is not a huge emphasis on the esoteric because Masonry, especially in America, we have a huge emphasis on like that Masonry is almost like a Swiss Army knife. You know what I mean? Many, 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 many
Mhm.
different tools, all contained in one thing. You could have a Swiss Army knife your whole life and only use maybe 2 or 3 of the different tools that are a part of it. But that doesn't make it any less utilitarian. It doesn't mean that if you gave that Swiss Army knife to somebody else that they couldn't pick it up and start using it for their own benefit. So I would say the Masonic Rite system is essentially a mystery school, whether it's acknowledged or not. That's something again that different men can debate amongst themselves. But I would say that essentially it's like a mystery school because it provides this framework, that allows you to be able to go even the most mundane Freemason, someone who has no interest in esotericism at all. They can take everything that happens within these rites and they can apply it to their own life and have a happier, healthier, more fulfilling life, regardless of if they do the esoteric stuff or if they don't. At the end of the day, you're going to become a better person because that's what this is all about, is about transmutation in some regard. Again, to whatever degree transmutation that is, full blown apotheosis or, just again, being a better person, being good to your spouse and being a good father, being a helpful member of the community. That's amazing just on the most mundane level. And so that's really what the Masonic Rite is that it's an alchemical process, again, to whatever degree that's up to the person. But no matter what, again, even the most mundane person is going to walk away. If they were paying attention even a little bit, they should be walking away a better person than when they first knocked on the door.
A quick follow-up question there. Do all Masonic rites have this alchemical structure that you're talking about, or is just specific for certain Masonic rites?
Um, I believe that the Blue Lodge essentially has this alchemical process no matter what, because these other rites like the York Rite, the Scottish Rite, etc., they have their own flavor and they have their own thing going on, and it's all based off of these first 3. You can't experience those without having this foundation. So I feel like that again, like the whatever, like the most true thing or the most truly Masonic thing is these Blue Lodge degrees, the first 3 degrees, and they are certainly alchemical just by their nature.
That's interesting. So I didn't know that the first three Masonic degrees could actually represent stages of alchemy. But while you were telling me that, I was thinking about it, and it kind of makes sense. But exactly like you pointed out, I'm not sure which one represents which stage. Now, the
Yeah.
logic is to be like Nigredo, Albedo, Rubedo in this order. But in the
Hmm.
third degree, for example, you can have all three. You can have the Nigredo, the Albedo, and the Rubedo as well. So it
Absolutely.
might represent Rubedo, but it may also contain the other three. So it's
How
interesting to think
Kabbalistic.
about it. Exactly. Okay, because you mentioned that is are Kabbalistic elements present in the Masonic rites or in the Masonic degrees?
100%. The very, very first things that you experience is essentially the Kabbalist, even though they don't necessarily say, hey, this is the Kabbalistic tree of life, when these degrees were created, these things were certainly in mind. I mean, the fact that you have the whole entire degree system based off of the construction of King Solomon's temple implies that there has to be some Kabbalistic element, just again, based off of the very first things that you ever see in a Masonic lodge, which is the pillars of Jachin and Boaz, which obviously
Mm.
represent the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy, respectively. There's a lot of debate between which pillar represents what, because solar and lunar or masculine feminine correspondences is kind of like one of those things that's debated. Even in my Golden Dawn temple, people get those confused all the time of which side of the body in and of itself is supposed to be Jachin and Boaz, or like that, or a pillar of severity and mercy and all that fun stuff. And then the initiate, again, these are if you're an esoterically inclined Mason, you will see that you as the initiate are the middle pillar. Then you are the middle pillar that of Malkuth, Tiferet, and Keter. With technically Da'at being in the third degree. There is that period. But anyway, the whole thing is that you are the middle pillar. And so this whole thing is extremely Kabbalistic.
I remember the first time I saw I started reading about the middle pillar and started looking at the Kabbalistic tree of life, Jachin and Boaz in the middle pillar. I realized instantly that you are supposed to be the middle pillar. You are supposed to be
Mhm.
the balancing force, and also the middle pillar is the spine,
Mhm.
actually. So I also was very fascinating by this discovery, and it was really interesting how it overlaps with Freemasonry. But I'm not sure if it is part of very old Masonic rituals or if it was a later edition. I'm curious about
Right.
that. When do you think when do you think Kabbalah entered Freemasonry? That's what I'm curious.
Well, I would say that it mostly started with when you have certain people like Kircher, these esoteric and Enlightenment era, Freemasons that were essentially becoming. I would say the transition really was when it went from operative masonry to speculative. When you had it as an operative degree system, it's very possible that some of these allegories were there, but the best records that we have is that the third degree was a later advent, and originally that in operative masonry there was only two degrees: the entered apprentice and the fellow craft. And then with the fellow craft there was that secret, and then there was word of a secret third degree, but it was never brought about, because it's implied that if you're a fellow craft, you're a fellow of the craft, you're a member of this guild, that you're a master mason. And then the master mason thing again was added later on with during when Enlightenment era speculative members started to join these lodges, and they started to then inject their fascination with, because that's during the Enlightenment, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that's when we had this resurgence of interest in Egyptology. Obviously, the more
Yeah.
arcane aspects of the Old Testament and things like that started to really come about. Just Kabbalah in general. Obviously, you had people argue that Frankism, the Frankist, whole like that. We can go down a rabbit hole with that, but yeah, that
Wow, you're not
that
holding
also
back.
that
I
Jewish.
didn't want to.
So essentially, Jewish members, Kabbalistically trained, heretical, Jews, eventually became involved in Freemasonry and started to inject Kabbalah into it, But yeah,
Mike, you're not
so
holding back.
well,
I
that's the cool
didn't.
thing about.
Go
Oh, go
ahead,
ahead.
please. Go
Oh,
ahead.
well, that's the cool thing, and that thing that I appreciate about the Grand Lodge of California is that they've done a really good job of educating us Masons of like what we can say and what we can't say. And
Mm.
essentially, there was a decision a long time ago. I was talking when I was an entered apprentice. Still, I met Grandmaster of California, or former Grandmaster of California, John Heisner. Really, really wonderful. He's passed away, unfortunately, now. God rest. But he was just a genius, and he wrote this book called "In Search of Master Hiram," and it's just wonderful. And it essentially, and I asked him, I'm like, how are you able to write about all this and like not get in trouble as a past grandmaster? I would
Yeah.
imagine that this would be almost like, again, like heretical. And he said, he's like, Mike, the only things that we consider secret are essentially the modes of recognition, so like the passwords, the grips, like all of those things, like that's essentially it. And then anything that's ciphered material, as long as you don't say, the ciphered material verbatim and like teach people that are non-Masons to read the cipher and things like that, he's like, he's like, you can just reword it in a slightly different way, and you can write about it. And I was just like, wow, that is so. From that point forward, as an EA, I was like the most heretical Mason to like all these like super old guys, and I was just like, the Grand Master of California literally told me personally that it's okay, like that it's okay, but they like didn't, either they didn't believe me or they didn't care, or again, they were so caught up in like, their own dogma, and again, tradition as well, but yeah, personally, that's where I'm at, is that if it's not any of those things, if this Grand Master can write a book this thick and essentially describe in extreme detail all of the different symbols, all of the different aspects of the rite, you know what I mean? That tells me everything I need to know,
Mike, there is so much I want to ask you, but let's do it. Let's do it in a proper order. So you
Yes.
said that you one thing you appreciate about your Grand Lodge is that they educate you on how you can on what you can speak.
Mhm.
So I want to ask you. I've seen a lot of Freemasons on the internet recently. Now, maybe before I was not paying attention to it, but
Mhm.
post pandemic, it seems that a lot of Freemasons started to go public. They started to talk about the craft. They started to be more open and
Mhm.
connect with the profane world more. Why do you think that that happens? Why are
Well,
Freemasons everywhere on the internet right now? Some of them going viral.
yeah. Honestly, I think that for many people, the pandemic was considered like this like negative, thing, and there was obviously there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, but honestly, during these periods where there is an intense amount of suffering, there's also an incredible amount of illumination and revelation that happens. And so I think that all at this time, there in the collective zeitgeist, when all of us got to essentially be monks and sit and be sequestered, some of us had to be sequestered at home or what have you for long periods of time. It forced us to really dig deep, And so with that, like there's been like almost like this revitalization of the esoteric and even occult aspects within the craft that people want. And also one thing that we've realized, especially as younger Masons, I had once one of the most like, because I was on my little high horse of like, esoteric, I was having an esoteric conversation, and a brother stopped me for a moment and was like, well, this is all fine and great, brother, but always remember that at the end of the day, we are here to make new Masons. If we don't make new Masons, then all of this esoteric stuff that you're talking about, it doesn't even matter. So first, let's focus on making new Masons, getting fresh, blood in here, I know that the conspiracy theorists will love that turn of phrase that I just used, but chum in the water. But it is one of those things where, like, I realized, we need to not necessarily recruit, but we need to be a little bit more forward facing. So that way, if you have younger, you know, uh, especially men, because we are do it's considered regular for it to be primarily male only. But if we want to bring in these young men, we need to let them know that we exist, because if
Yeah.
Gen Z and those people don't even know that this even exists, you know what I mean? We're not going to be doing degrees. We're not going to be making new Masons, and the craft is going to die. And it's
Yeah.
gone through periods of great regression. And unfortunately, my mother lodge, Yucca Valley 802 out in Joshua Tree, they folded because they didn't have enough brothers to put on degrees. I had moved away, and a couple of brothers had essentially moved out of the area. And but even before that, I was very adamant, like, hey, like, we need to do public events. I love esoterica, but I also think that we need to be super involved and get more involved in our communities, because otherwise, again, young people, if these, if we aren't doing scholarships with, like, the schools or things like that, these young people will never see a square and compass, and they'll have no idea what it is. But if we're there, I can't tell you how many brothers now that have been, because I'm out in Whittier, we have a really great Masonic scholarship program. And so we've had a couple brothers who are like, oh, I heard about Freemasonry because I got this award when I was in, like, junior high for, great citizenship or whatever, like a citizenships award from the lodge. And it implanted in my brain, oh, cool, like, these Masons are really cool. And so then later on, they ended up knocking on the door of a lodge because, just from getting this award. So we also need to be doing these things as well. We need to be, and one of the best ways is to go on TikTok and essentially talk about Freemasonry, so that way young people can be like, oh, okay, cool. How do I join? And now there's like, everybody does the same TikTok, script, which is like, you can literally just Google a Freemasonic lodge, find out when they meet, go and hang out with them. If they like you, you like them, you'll get an application. It's very simple, very easy.
So the conclusion will be that currently Freemasonry is going through a struggling phase. First of all, getting new members in and retaining members. So that will that will be in contradiction to what the conspiracy theorists say, that you control the world. Why do you think that narrative is still present?
Well, because it's just so much easier for there to be like this boogeyman, than to take any kind of personal responsibility for how your life is. It's way easier to say my life is shit because of this evil pedophilic cabal of Freemasons who are of the Illuminati that are destroying my life, rather than taking any kind of personal responsibility for how things are going. And also to take personal responsibility in the sense that if the government that you're under, if the conclusion that you're at is that the government is tyrannical and is ruining your life, and that's why you're not getting ahead, and it's not a personal thing, like you've done all the things that you could do in order to be happy, healthy, and successful in life, and you're still miserable, it's up to you and the collective people of society to then overthrow that government, and get rid of them and replace it with something better, ideally. So again, Masons have nothing to do with that. Now, I will say, like, I was on a podcast with another brother Freemason called Paranoid American, and one of the things we talked at was bad Masons, and we acknowledged that, like P2, or like this current French lodge of hitmen, and like CIA, intelligence operatives and police and all these things that were part of this lodge. So there are also bad Masons, but there's also bad occultists. There's bad politicians. There's bad doctors. There's bad lawyers. There's bad everything.
There is bad everything.
Right. So like so the cool thing about Masonry, and we talked a little bit about this behind the scenes, but it's this idea that Masonry itself is a tool. And then whatever it is that you use that tool for, whether it be to be a Napoleon Bonaparte and, essentially conquer most of Europe because he was a Freemason, or if you were, that's why he didn't get executed. Yeah, that's why he didn't get executed, because
I wanted to make a video. Sorry for interrupting. I'm not interrupting my guests usually, but you just dropped a bomb there, and I want to push back a little bit against it, because based on my own personal research, I don't have insider information, but people are still debating if Bonaparte was a Freemason. Now, for me personally, the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the fact that he was one, but that they destroyed either the documents, and we don't have actual physical proof that he was a Freemason. But if you look at his life, his family, his relatives were grandmasters throughout Europe of Masonic jurisdictions. So even the symbolism of his tomb his expeditions into Egypt, because it was thanks to the Napoleonic expeditions that we were finally able to find the Rosetta Stone and decipher
Correct.
Egyptian hieroglyphics. So there are a lot of esoteric elements in the Napoleonic lore. So why are you so certain that he was a Freemason? I'm not allowed to say that, but
Well, I understand that certain people, like in history, are almost, like there's a phrase that we like to use called "too big to fail." So it's like when when a bank it needs to be bailed out by the government and they're about to collapse, rather than the government letting them collapse, they bail them out. And there's certain institutions that are what we think is too big to fail. But there's so many instances where really great men were still executed, were still killed. And so Napoleon was one of those people where I really do believe that if he wasn't a Freemason, that he would have been executed. Again, people argue, oh, well, the reason why is because people knew that if you killed him, you would just make a martyr out of him. I don't really believe that. I really do think that the British Empire was more than powerful enough to have just chopped that dude's head off and called it a day. Shot him square between the eyebrows, called it a day. Firing squad, whatever the hell you want. But they decided twice to sequester him to an island. And so there's a myth, there's a fun Masonic myth that essentially, because there's this thing called the grand hailing sign, which is whenever you're in a moment of absolute distress where your life is in jeopardy, you give the grand hailing sign, and any Mason that's present has to do everything within their power to save your life. Everything that is within their power, unless it risks losing their own. So there's a myth that essentially when he was on trial, that when he was given the death penalty, he did the grand hailing sign. And because this is the British, this is the royalty of Europe, obviously, that we're talking about, they were all Masons. They were all Freemasons. And so by their Masonic obligation, they could not kill Napoleon. Now, again, you could just say, oh, well, like people have, betrayed their obligations. Like, why does that matter? Again, this is all political theater, right? And this is all, and also, again, like there probably was like this type of like, I almost like, I respect you, as much as I hate you, Napoleon, I respect you kind of a thing, potentially. Again, this is all part of like, this is total, mythology, Masonic mythology, but it's this idea that because and then the second time when they did it again, they were like, okay, this time, we what's the word I'm looking for? Where they send people. I'm trying to remember the term when they send people off like to an island or something. Anyway, you're banished. Exile. Thank you. I don't know why I couldn't think of the word, but they exiled him twice. And so to me, it's like, again, like after the first, shame on fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice. Like I'm gonna. Like now you're on the guillotine, you know what I mean? But no, they didn't. So twice it's supposed that he gave the grand hailing sign, and so they were like, shit, we can't kill. So they're like, okay, fine, we're gonna send you to St. Helena, and luckily that's where he stayed and died. But I personally believe that the reason why they didn't execute him was, again, one, political. It was a political thing. Two, out of respect, and three, part of it is because he was a Freemason. So. I think that all of those things could be very, very true.
I had no idea about that. See, when you are an initiate, you know more things. I didn't know about that sign where Freemason is supposed to save you. It's an interesting fact.
Yeah, it's there's a really cool I believe it's called. I forget what the statue is called, but there's a statue in Washington, D.C., and it was actually one of the very first times, because I went to Washington, D.C. in 8th grade to see the different monuments and see like the Declaration and all these different things. And one of the things that really was striking was there's this statue, and it's essentially a Union officer aiding a Confederate officer who's on the ground, and essentially, and it has a big square and compass, and it's like, essentially this whole thing about brotherly love, that even though these people were on two opposite sides of the most brutal war in American history, no other war has had the same level of American casualties than the American Civil War, obviously. And so but like the fact that these two brothers who are so diametrically opposed could in a moment, transcend that and, aid one another. It's this idea of distress, of Masonic distress, and that happened many times in World War. In fact, if you don't mind me, if you don't mind
Absolutely
entertaining, the
not.
reason why you asked me a long time ago why, or like at the beginning, why I became a Freemason. So can I give you like a short story of what actually made me seek out a lodge?
Absolutely. Go
So
ahead.
okay, so I was an EMT for quite some time, for 6 years, and I worked primarily in the emergency room, and which is obviously a very fast paced, very volatile, environment. Um, well, one night it was actually very very calm. It was very very boring actually, and this old man came in who had accidentally fallen and broken his hip in the middle of the night, and so we were essentially waiting for, we had just done an x-ray and we were waiting for a radiologist to interpret the x-ray so that way we could get all the information, or excuse me, it was a dislocated hip. He didn't break his hip, it dislocated. But we needed to make sure it wasn't broken, so we were waiting for these results to come back so that way we could just pop the sucker back in and send this old man on his way home. And so while I'm obviously helping, set up his stuff, I'm an old soul, and so I get along with old people, and I can instantly strike up a conversation with any old person, and it's always a really beautiful and enlightening experience. But I'm talking to this gentleman, and I see that he has a ring with a square and compass on it. So I start asking him about Freemasonry, and he clarifies a lot of different things, like, oh no, like you don't have to be, you don't have to have family, you don't have to have, he dispelled a lot of like the rumors and misconceptions that I had about the craft, about how to join. And I finally asked him, I'm like, well, what do you think about like Masonry on personally? Like, what has your journey been? And he was actually still a very frequent member of a daylight lodge, which is like for older folks who can't drive at night. There's lodges that exist that meet in the daytime, so that way old Masons who can't drive at night can still go to degrees and stuff. And so he was like, I really think that the reason why I don't have, any kind of Alzheimer's, dementia, or anything like that, and why I'm able to still live on my own. And he was like 90, he was really old.
Wow.
And so I was like, how are you able to like not live in a home, essentially? And like, how did you keep your sanity? That's one of my, like, at the time, that was one of my biggest fears, was senility and like losing my mind, losing my intellect. And so he said, well, I think that Masonry, just because it's strict, has all this repetition, it has all this memorization, and it forces you to then keep your mind extremely sharp. And he goes, I think that Masonry in and of itself helps to stave off a lot of the degeneration of the mind in old age. He goes, so I think that Masonry actually really helped me there. And he's like, but let me tell you probably the best story I can tell you. And he's like, and if this doesn't convince you to join, I don't think anything will. He's like, I was fighting on the eastern front of the war during the Battle of the Bulge, and essentially we essentially experienced a night raid from the Germans, because they were desperate. It was getting closer to the end of the war, to the closing of the war. So, they were absolutely desperate. And so they ended up doing a night raid, which was very uncharacteristic at the time, or at least to him or to his platoon, at least how they saw it. They just couldn't believe it. And so he ended up getting separated from his platoon, and he was sitting in a foxhole, and essentially just being like, I effing hate this. I want to go home. Like, this is just terrible. Like, just really just like, he's in the middle of a battle, and so, but he's been separated. He has no idea where anybody is. And all of a sudden, while he's sitting in this foxhole, essentially out of like through the trees comes this Nazi, and he ends up trying to fire his gun. It jams, and then he pulls the gun out from this guy's hand, and they go to hand-to-hand combat. And essentially, he ended up on his back, and just as the German was about to plunge his knife into his chest, just at that moment, through the trees, a shaft of moonlight literally hit his lapel, and clearly, apparently, to the German, he saw a square and compass pin, which you're not supposed to wear. You're not supposed to, because only military stuff is supposed to be on your uniform. But this American soldier put a Masonic pin on his lapel anyway. And because he saw that Masonic pin, the German stopped, leaned in, said a couple of secret words, which I'm not going to say here because they're part of the cipher. And then he sheathed his knife and then left. So he did not kill this guy in the foxhole because he saw the Masonic square and compass. So that means that this Nazi
Wow.
obviously was a Freemason. And so again, this thing that this brotherhood transcends things like that, a certain ideological, programming that, where it's like, you're supposed to kill this person. And this man literally stopped just, in the middle of it's a very beautiful story. And so again, I don't know if how true it is, but this 90-year-old dude really didn't have any reason to lie. He seemed like a pretty
Well, if this
believable
story
guy, but
made
it was
you,
cool.
yeah, if this story made you join Freemasonry, then it worked, I guess. But
Oh, it did.
if you have no regrets afterwards, then it doesn't matter because
Yeah.
the principles of the craft and its philosophy aligns with the story perfectly. So even if it's true or not, the value is still there in it. Mike, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. We had some technical problems, but we're back online. Now, I want to ask you about Masonic symbolism because a lot of people are interested in that. So, how I will do this is I will just name some of Masonic symbols and I will ask you to explain them and share as much of the esoteric aspects of them as you possibly can, because I know there are some restrictions in this regard. So, the first symbol that I'm interested in discussing is the checkered floor. Would you mind explaining that for the audience?
Yes, absolutely. So the checkered, and then also with usually with a tessellated border. The checkered floor is, it's white and black, and it represents. It's pretty. It's a little bit more on the nose as far as a symbol. It's supposed to be
Yeah.
like as you're because the lodge is essentially a mystery school, and the whole thing is supposed to be about how to make life better. It's all about life essentially, and the experience of the soul manifesting into this material realm and what it is that we're going to experience. It represents light and darkness. So essentially, it's meant to actually represent this really beautiful aspect of duality. So essentially, as soon as you have you're not just like the one thing. Because we obviously start off and we focus on the one creator, the great architect of the universe, whatever you want to call it, but it's the one thing. But as soon as the one thing decides to become a universe, now you have duality. And so now you have to experience this aspect of duality. So the Shiva Shakti dynamism that is happening, or you can call it Isis, Osiris, whatever you want to call it. But it's this aspect of dynamism, or Zoroastrianism between, obviously the good God and the bad God. And so you are going to encounter the duality of life. And so again, on its most esoteric aspects, it's this aspect of like the masculine feminine principle of the manifest universe, that there's like this ground essentially of the, formless God, and then there is the form, which is which would be Shakti, the feminine principle. And so that is essentially what the checkered floor is meant to represent: light and darkness, ignorance and wisdom, all of the things that we experience that feel so polarized, based off of our what I would argue is like a misguided understanding of the soul, because it's veiled, to us.
Will that make, because it's one of the most prominent and one of the main Masonic symbols, will that make Freemasonry dualistic?
Technically, no. What it is I would argue that Masonry, at least in its like worldview and philosophy, it's non-dual in the sense that, again, all of this aspect, even the dual in and of itself, is manifested because of the one. So we are non-dual technically, but we acknowledge, just like how like in like Kashmiri Shaivism and Tantra, they kind of they acknowledge that, hey, the manifest universe is real. Like it is a real thing. It's not just Maya. That's what kind of separates it from like Advaita Vedanta, or something like that, where they think that like this whole thing is an illusion. No, we very much, and this is also very Kabbalistic as well, we believe that everything is just the one thing, right, is the one God, but we do acknowledge also that this isn't just an illusion. We acknowledge that this is like a real thing that we have to experience, that reality is reality. You know what I mean? And so it is dual. And so all non-dual, most non-dual religions or spiritual beliefs or whatever, they acknowledge that there is dualism, and so like technically they are dualistic at the same time of being non-dualistic. You know what I mean? If you're a non-dualist, you're technically a dualist to some degree, just, you know, until you get to like that one, until you're acknowledging and you're thinking about the one thing, and then you've now transcended the dual. But you should acknowledge that the dual is there. And so I would say yes and no.
Okay, because you shared that beautiful story before. What does the square and compass represent?
So the square and compass represents the which is the same principle of the synthesis between matter and spirit. So you have obviously the compass, which draws a circle. Circle represents not only unity but also the divine. Also triangle. The triangle obviously is more so like specifically like divine versus the material. And then the square is obvious. And then square is always been represents the world, represents the material and manifest universe. That's why you have like the 4 Kabbalistic worlds, because 4 points to a square. You have the 4 Kabbalistic worlds, the 4 elements, all those things, and then that 5th element, that the all-pervading spirit, comes from the circle. And so this all comes from like that, the allegory of squaring the circle, which was deemed impossible. I forget by which Enlightenment era geometrician proved that, but essentially it's been proven that squaring the circle is impossible. But that's what makes it of such a perfect allegory, because it's only God could do something like that. You know what I mean? Not only not only create, but also permeate his own creation and be one and part of it. And so that's essentially what the square and compass represents, is this yoga, this divine union between the material and the spiritual.
What about the circumpunct?
The circumpunct, that's one of my absolute favorite symbols. So the circumpunct is essentially, again, it's another way of saying, we have so many different ways of saying the same thing. You have the point within the circle. So the point obviously being the absolute, the one, the circle being essentially all of its creation, which is like essentially part of the body of God. If the point is essentially like what you call the mind of God, you have the boundary, which would then be like that essentially this boundary, because creation has to have some kind of boundary within it. And then you have the 2 pillars, with the perpendicular pillars, which represent the Kabbalistic pillars of Jachin and Boaz, pillar of severity and mercy. So this idea of, again, this fixed boundary, because unfortunately a circle can just instantly expand forever, but the universe can't sustain itself that way. So there is these metaphorical boundaries, or these limits, that even God puts on itself intentionally, because it could just be boundless, but it decides where the circumference is going to stop. And then we always have like I don't know if it's like this everywhere, but in American lodges we have the Holy Bible or some kind of holy scripture. It'll say like Holy Writ above. So it's this idea of like divine law essentially creates these specific boundaries. It is the will of God that, as he's acting, willing, and knowing, he is creating these boundaries to the manifest universe, which stems from the point. So it's like it's an extreme, I think honestly, the point within the circle is probably the most arcane symbol that we have. It's probably one of the most complex that we have, even though it looks so simple. And it's usually totally dismissed or missed, So, but it's my personal favorite.
It's one of my favorite symbols as well, particularly because it symbolizes the monad. So it's a very interesting symbol. It's very layered, and exactly as you pointed out, for such a apparently simple arrangement of elements, it conveys a lot of meaning, and it's fascinating to say the least. Now, I also
Absolutely.
want to ask you. You mentioned Jachin and Boaz. Of course, these 2 pillars are also present on the tarot card of the Popes. So I also want to ask you what these 2 pillars represent in Masonic lore.
So these actually represent very similar to like the checkered floor, this idea of this dualism. But what's really fascinating is that each of these pillars in Freemasonry is attributed to two patron saints, and this is kind of slept on. This is something where in the Masonic obligation, you're always going to swear yourself to a lodge of the Holy Saints John of Jerusalem, and this is something that is not explained in Masonic lecture really or anything like that, and so it's probably one of the weirdest, I would say, like most obscure parts of the ritual for most modern Masons. They have no idea what this means. They usually don't even care. They don't even, it maybe doesn't even cross their mind. But for me, as an esoterically inclined Mason, anytime that something is like touched on very briefly and there's no explanation, that's where I know is like the juiciest, most esoteric stuff. So the two Saints John are represented by Jachin and Boaz, and what Saint John the Baptist and Saint John the Evangelist. Saint John the Baptist was the precursor and essentially the one who initiated Christ, Jesus, as the Christ, you know. So without this, essentially this baptism that John performs, arguably Jesus the Christ does not exist in as far as being essentially a guru. I mean, if you really look at like John the Baptist and Jesus, they actually resemble very much so, almost like this sadhu, you know, Indian sadhu type of relationship where there's this dispensation of spirit, of teaching from one to another. So John essentially baptizes Christ and is responsible for, and essentially once John the Baptist is killed, his disciples for the most part become a lot of Jesus's followers. You know what I mean? They essentially say, hey, we're going to jump on board with you because, you know, number one, John told us to, and number two, John's dead. So, I'm going to take this one. So he's the precursor to the Christ, which is important, but he represents, because of water, he represents the gate of Cancer because his festival is on the summer solstice. So it's usually on the 24th of June. And so we celebrate the St. John the Baptist essentially not only as a precursor, but he represents the gate of Cancer, which is well known in occultism as the gate of Cancer is essentially where the soul incarnates. So essentially before you were born, you go through and you pass through the gate of Cancer, which is water initiation. Also something to be considered that our mothers have to, obviously their water breaks before they give birth to us. So we receive that sacred initiation from our mothers as we leave the womb. And also we are transitioned from essentially as a baby in the, obviously breathing through amniotic fluid. So we go from essentially being a water creature to an air breathing creature like that, like very, and so that in and of itself, this idea of initiation through the path of purification in water is represented by St. John the Baptist. And that would be in, either Jachin or Boaz, depending on which correspondence you want to give. And then St. John the Evangelist is in December. And so that represents essentially after the soul has gone through its twilight period, at the end of its life, once it's actually gone through enough incarnations and it has achieved apotheosis and is able to merge with the Creator, it passes through St. John the Evangelist, who's represented by fire. And that fire essentially burns away whatever material or residual aspects of karma, and you essentially are able then to pass through that gate of fire into the Empyrean with the one, if that is your will, that is. So it's a very esoteric idea that essentially you have the gate of water, or the gate of Cancer, and you have the gate of Capricorn, which are each represented by St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, respectively. So it's essentially a way of Masonry also aligning itself with reincarnation in an esoteric and subtle way, which for some people, for some Westerners, is like a big deal. Obviously, to believe in reincarnation is very, very difficult for a lot of Westerners. And so this is maybe like what I always thought was like a really nice, subtle way of getting, essentially these ultra, Christian Protestant people thinking about, hey, maybe, there's something to this, which is interesting because, Jesus himself is said to have had pre-incarnations in the Bible. There's this whole thing of the angel there, certain places in the Bible, there's the angel of the Lord with a capital A. Most of the time the Bible will say, this is the angel Gabriel, Raphael, whoever. They'll be very specific about who this is. But then in these particular cases, very only a few times throughout the Old Testament, there's the angel of the Lord, which is supposed to be the pre-incarnation, the Christophany, the pre-incarnation of the Christ. And so, it's kind of interesting that we have such a hard time with reincarnation, but it's actually part of the tradition. It's part of being a Christian, is that you believe that essentially the Christos is a reincarnating Maha Avatar, not just like one dude, not just one dude named Jesus, So
we'll
funny.
come back to this idea with
Yeah.
previous incarnations of Christ, but it's also interesting that the Masonic keystone stands where the gate of Cancer, or where the zodiac sign of Cancer stands. So that's also a particularly interesting fact. Now, because you opened up this discussion, why do you think astrology is such an important and core part of Freemasonry, and yet it's being rejected by a lot of Freemasons?
Well, I think a lot of the things that Masonry is supposed to have, or that does have, comes from essentially this like pre-industrial and this revitalization of like the way that our healthcare system works, the way that that science is that astrology is not real, doesn't exist, or it's not scientifically accepted. And so that's the main reason why I think that modern day Masons don't accept it, is because they are Baconian, essentially. A lot of, I would argue that most people today are essentially like material atheists, even though they may say that they're Christian or say that they're this or that. They're, in their actual practice in their day in, day out life, they're material atheists or material agnostics. And so I think that essentially astrology has been given a pretty bad rap in the West, and so we don't incorporate that into healthcare or science or any of those things. But one of the things that is emphasized in Freemasonry is travel. And so one of the things that we have to remember as Masons is the reason why we keep the zodiacal signs, I believe, is because they have, at the very least, mundane Masons, Muggle Masons, or whatever you want to call them, they will at the very least concede that these stars is how we've been able to navigate and how we've been able to like plot, obviously, the understand the globe and use cartography, which is extremely important, obviously. So I think that to that degree, the zodiac has been at least kept because we at least acknowledge that the zodiac has a place as far as navigation and travel. That is one of the most distinguishing factors, and that's why the term Freemason even exists. A lot of people forget that back in the day, you didn't really have any. He didn't have the same freedoms that we take for granted today. The fact that we can just hop on a train and just go to a different country or a different state or whatever, or go on a plane and just freely travel, essentially, that wasn't something that existed during the medieval fiefdom era. And so when you wanted to travel somewhere, you needed to have written dispensation from the king, prince, or potentate who was in charge of your area, and they could easily deny that. But a Freemason, what made them free is that they were sovereign. What made them envied, and what made them which, funny enough, like there's like this weird envy of Masons, I would argue today, which is why we're so hated. But this idea of that, the fact that you could freely travel from place to place, and not only do that, but you could actually go to a king, and if he says, build me a church, you can say, okay, this is my price. You can negotiate prices with the royalty, which back in the day would be like, who the hell are you? I was ordained by God to be a king, to be a ruler, to be a baron or whatever. Like, who are you to negotiate? But they knew that they had to, because in order for that, because Freemasons, these Master Masons, had sacred knowledge to build the most beautiful and the most ornate buildings, that the Masons that were in their area weren't going to have the knowledge, weren't going to be able to create the same works of art that these Master Masons and these temple builders, these cathedral builders were able to do. And so there's this aspect of sovereignty. Really, what Freemasonry, why we have that weird name in the first place, is it means sovereign builder. And so it means that you are the sovereign ruler. You are essentially you are the God, the creator of your own life. And so if your life isn't the way that you want it to be. It is literally up to you to take up that sovereignty and to reclaim it for yourself, And so that's what Freemasonry arguably also does, is that it teaches you this aspect of personal sovereignty that you just wouldn't normally consider, or again, that we nowadays take for granted. So we just go like, oh, what's the big deal? But so the zodiac, I do believe, to circle back, is really important because, again, like we were able to travel, from place to place, country to country. And so there is, and funny enough, in the third degree, there's an emphasis, there's a small thing about sailing, there's this aspect of traveling by boat because there's a seafaring man. So, and the way that they're greeted as if like they're kinsmen, as if they're, even though he's not a Mason, he's considered, obviously a master of his craft, which is traveling by sea, which is obviously extremely important for the human race. I don't think that humans would be where we're at. We wouldn't, this all wouldn't exist if, we didn't travel
Perfect.
around.
Thank you so much for these explanations. It gives a lot of clarity, and it was also very interesting. Now, I also want to ask you. You mentioned God. I want to ask you what the letter G symbolizes in Freemasonry.
So the letter G represents, again, one little tiny thing that represents so much. The G, on its most like mundane level, and it's even explained in the lectures, and I believe it's even in plain English, so it's like even more, it's like very, very just well known. It represents G for geometry, which we consider one of the most, of all the arts and sciences, of all the different liberal arts and sciences, this is considered the most sacred because from the study of geometry, you essentially have, again, all science essentially built off of that, because from that, it just everything permeates. And it also ties back to Pythagoras and this idea that essentially numbers and math, essentially the coding, if you wanted, the zeros and ones of this simulation we call a universe, are essentially that everything is encoded, essentially. So that geometry, so stands for G, stands for God, obviously, but with the emphasis, they specifically say it emphasizes God, but particularly the generative principle. So, we acknowledge that, God is obviously triune and willing, acting, knowing. And G to me stands for generate, or God, excuse me, is an acronym for generate, order, destroy. Those are the three things that God is constantly doing, that the universe is constantly doing, that we are constantly doing: generate, order, destroy. And so the G is essentially like the initiatic point, because this is a mystery school and it's all about initiation. So the initiating force of creating anything, whether it be a universe or whether it's your own life or it's a business or whatever, an invention, I don't care what it is. It starts with the G. So it's the initiating point, of inspiration, of God. Also, the G, interesting enough, synthesizes a lot of different things, particular, because again, why G? Why not A, right? Why not alpha? Why, if you're going to do, this kind of symbol, or again, like, why is it in Scottish Rite and other rites they have a yod, for yod he vav he, but it's the yod, so it's that generative principle of the tetragrammaton. Well, what's interesting about G is that it happens to be the seventh letter in the alphabet. And also, so you have the number 7, so that represents the 7 days of creation. So that has many, many occult tie-ins with the number 7. But then you also have it in Sanskrit as G, and also in Kabbalah as Gimel. They both represent numerically the number 3. So you simultaneously have 3, which is the triplicity, and then you also have 7, which is the triplicity, the yoga, the union of the triangle and the square, which is also represented by the Masonic apron. In some aprons, they have like a rounded bottom, but really traditionally, Masonic apron is a square with a triangular flap. And so that is meant to represent the synthesis of spirit and the divine, spirit and the divine and the material square. So it's this idea of like essentially that we are both material, but then also we are also spirit,
I want to interrupt you a little bit because I've seen something on my Masonic aprons. I will ask you what why are Freemasons wearing aprons as well? But I've noticed that some Freemasons sometimes wear a pentagram on their aprons, while some of them wear an inverted pentagram on their aprons. So why does the symbol flip? We know that reversing the symbols usually represents a perversion, or that it represents the opposite of what the initial symbol meant. Although there is a case to be made that symbols have this duality built inside of them, and you just switch the symbolism based on the stage that you're currently at. So I also wanted to ask you, what do Masonic aprons represent, and why do inverted pentagrams sometimes show up in Masonic symbolism?
Yes. So the upright pentagram is the blazing star, which we consider, which is also sometimes you'll have like with the tessellated floor in the center will be the blazing star, and so this represents the occult and esoteric aspects of the number 5. Which again, it's this idea of the synthesis between the 4 elements and that 5th element being spirit, and so it represents all 5 elements. So the pentagram was extremely popular with the cult of Pythagoras, and so the blazing star carries those different the occult aspects of the number 5, which is also the incorporation of shin into the tetragrammaton. So you have yod, he, shin, vav, he, which is Yeshua, which represents Christ consciousness. So you have that, which would be the blazing star. Now, the inverted star is actually not technically like something you're going to find in Masonic ritual. It is actually going to be usually a brother Freemason who has joined what is known as the Order of the Eastern Star. And so the Order of the Eastern Star is is essentially it's based off of the 5 patron or I should say matrons of the Bible. It's like Ruth, Sarah, Mary. I can't remember all the others. Ruth, Sarah, Mary, Esther, somebody else. But it's essentially the 5 matrons. And so this is actually a group that is made for wives of Freemasons. And so the ritual is very much it has spiritual and esoteric components, but it's mostly like how to be a good wife. You know what I mean? It's how to be a good feminine component to your husband, your Mason husband. And so it is essentially like it's the Masonic version for, it's Masonry for women. From my understanding, it's definitely not as Kabbalistic. It's definitely not as esoteric usually as that, but men can join. So if you want your husband to be a part of your Eastern Star Lodge, you can have him join, and so then you'll see Masons that will wear an Eastern Star logo, but that's just because they're part of their wife's Eastern Star group. But generally, you won't see like just the upside down pentagram by itself. It's usually going to be colored in a certain way and have other little markings. That's Eastern Star, and it's the 5 main matrons of the Bible.
So it will not represent the descent into matter or the Freemason at a certain stage being involved with a more materialistic aspect of the craft.
Right. Like, if you were to show me a rite where, and especially again, I would have to see like if it's like, for example, I've done the Scottish rite, and we have an apron that has like just a normal pentagram on it. I believe it's red, but it's a red and white apron, and it's with a particular Scottish rite degree. But the upside down pentagram is generally you'll notice it has like different colors. That's Eastern Star. So that's just a Mason who decided to join his wife's Eastern Star Lodge. Now, I'm sure that there are, I'm sure it's extremely rare, but I'm sure that if there's Eastern Star, especially in like, other in Europe and stuff, they probably actually will have some fun esoteric elements that they could, argue and say, because also you'll notice that the different colors, they're representing, again, the elements. So you have yellow for air, red for fire, blue for water, green for earth. These can also these also have like certain alchemical attributes because, again, they're colored, right? So it's got to have technically some underlying alchemical stuff. And then also because these matrons are members of the Bible, they have to have some type of Kabbalistic correspondence. Now, I've never done Eastern Star because I don't have a partner who's a part of a lodge of Eastern Star or anything like that. And again, like I already got all kinds of other stuff going on, so another club and another set of dues would be stressful, too much on my plate. But yeah, usually it's going to be Eastern Star. If you showed me a Masonic apron that had just a straight up upside down pentagram with no, and it's not an Eastern Star logo, I haven't experienced that, so I wouldn't know. But you could make it.
Yeah,
I would imagine that it's something like that. It's
I
some kind
will
of like
send
almost
you a
like a
photo after our.
Luciferian. Oh, okay. Yeah, some kind of like Luciferian aspect or something like that. You know what I mean?
I will send you a photo after our conversation. I'm
Oh,
really
okay.
curious about that. And you opened the Pandora's box right now, so I gotta ask you about this. Um, Lucifer is one of the
Mm-hmm.
most misunderstood terms in general, not only
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to Freemasonry. A lot of people are confused about what it means. Where does the name
Yeah.
come from? So I want to ask you, who is Lucifer, or what does Lucifer represent? And is Freemasonry Luciferian?
Yeah. I would say that if it depends on, again, somebody's understanding and how they interpret Lucifer. Personally, I am aligned with Manly P. Hall and Pike, which is this idea that and many other occultists, that Lucifer essentially is a Promethean. It's essentially like he's Prometheus, or even in Polynesian culture, because my mom's side of the family is Hawaiian Portuguese. We have Maui, and Maui is exactly the same thing. He's Prometheus. He went and he took fire from the gods and brought it down to mankind. And essentially, by giving us fire, he gave us not only obviously our way of being able to create society, which is good, but it's also bad, right? Because society also takes us out of nature, and it essentially strips us of our purpose. So it's illuminating, but it's also simultaneously concealing, because once you have the creature comforts of society, that just is going to come with its own set of problems, right? And like now you've detached yourself, and now you're not going to be as close to God. You've left the Garden of Eden, so to speak, to create society, which is a shame, because again, the Garden of Eden was perfect. The garden was great. It was perfect, right? Like, when you look at like Native American society, you know what I mean, and like what American colonization did to their way of life, now they're dying. They have all kinds of ailments and things that just weren't a problem before we showed up and messed it all up. So it's this idea of like, that the dispensation of light can be a good thing. This dispensation of light can be very wonderful, but also comes with the downfall of pride, with the fall of
Mm.
man as well. So it's like, it's a good thing, and it's also Lucifer is good, but he's also evil at the same time. Very demiurgic, in a certain sense as well. And this idea that, like, again, this beautiful, people can hate on the demiurge, but like life, this life experience, it comes with suffering, yes, but it also comes with some of the most orgasmic, beautiful experiences that you can possibly have. Angels don't get to eat chocolate, but I get to eat chocolate. And just that aspect of sitting there basking with the piece of chocolate in my mouth makes me go, the creator's not evil. Yes, again, I not only, I could be eating this chocolate, but the chocolate can also give me diabetes, which sucks. But I mean, again, like, it is what it is. It's this aspect of the walking the checkered floor of life.
Yes, but some people will say that's uh, you've seen the Matrix, I'm sure, but that's what
Yes.
that's what Cypher will say from the Matrix,
Right.
that he still enjoys the steak, and even though it's fake, it's not real. But
Right.
before we talk about the demiurge, let me push back a little bit more, because maybe
Sure.
the answer was not as clear as people want it to be. Now
Hmm.
we know Lucifer comes from a Bible mistranslation. We know
Right.
that Lucifer is used in the Catholic Eastern Vigil. Not a lot of people know that every year. In fact, Lucifer is associated with Jesus there. So that's an interesting aspect. Also, in the Gnostic lore, Lucifer is associated with Christ because he is the one who wakes up humanity. He represents the Promethean principle there. And you also said an interesting thing here that which I disagree with, that the garden is the ideal state. And for me, it's like, yes, but like an it's like a totalitarian system, you know. Everything is perfect, everything is beautiful there, but there is no consciousness, there is no freedom of thought, there is no free will, so to speak.
Right.
You're living by the demiurge's decree. And like Adam and Eve in the garden are not even aware that they are naked. They're living essentially like animals, because you could say animals still enjoy this primordial state of bliss, that they partake in nature without consciously knowing precisely what they're doing. So in some way, yes, it's perfect, it's ideal, it sounds good because you're partaking in nature and you're respecting the rules, but at the same time, it's not what we as humans represent currently. And I couldn't imagine life for myself without having this free will, without being able to think and be self-aware. So from my perspective, I'm opposed to that. But I want to go back to this idea of Freemasonry being Luciferian, because we have Albert Pike mentioning Lucifer in his writings, and a lot of Freemasons refute that. So it's important to establish what Lucifer represents before we associate Lucifer with Freemasonry. So I want you to clarify that for me. If the Masonic light, because it's also a symbol present, the dispensation of the light, is this light the Luciferian light, or is like a raw force that must be transmuted and must be brought into balance?
So the dispensation of light, at least from my perspective, again, it's this idea that I believe that it would be Luciferian, again, based off of what we're talking about, which is this idea of revelation. That's essentially what the Gnostics, right, believed that the snake does, is that he reveals the knowledge of good and evil, or he inspires Eve initially, but then also Adam, to partake of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. So essentially, it's this idea of like, how I kind of view it is that, you know, the garden represents this astral, like kind of the astral realm where like angels and stuff are, which is essentially like they don't really get, again, no free will. They just, they are literally, it's like them and God just all the time, you know? And so for them, they don't get to, again, experience the things that we get to experience. And so by partaking this fruit of knowledge of good and evil, this aspect of a duality mindset is what essentially makes us exit the garden, you know? And again, we get to experience chocolate, but we also get to experience cancer. You know what I mean? So it's like, give and take. So for me, the light is, again, this dispensation of, it's this understanding of that knowledge. So like the knowledge, the Masonic light is the understanding of, obviously, this aspect that, hey, God exists, but I am also having to experience this life. And so it's that realization that, you know, both of these things are true, and what am I going to do with that information now that I know? You know, how is this going to influence and change my life? And so that's why Masonic light is revealed by degrees. Because if you just blasted the fire hose, you know, somebody with the fire hose, they're going to be they're going to be injured. And even then, you know, so for me, I don't just participate in like ceremonial magic in the West. I also study Eastern mysticism, specifically Kashmiri Shaiva Tantra. And one of the aspects of this is this thing of what's known as Diksha, but then also Shaktipata. And Shaktipata essentially means the descent of grace. So it's the descent of God's grace. And so this is the moment when you have a Shaktipata enlightenment experience. It is the revelation. It's the thing that essentially pulls one of the major veils from behind your eyes and allows you to then actually seek a spiritual life in general. And so essentially anytime, what Masonic ritual does is it by degrees initiates you into this light of God, which allows you to be able to live in the world while simultaneously being able to have these hopefully these higher revelations of understanding with the divine. Gnosis, we talked about the letter G. The G can also potentially represent gnosis. And so that's experiential knowledge. One of the reasons why I advocate for people, if they are really interested in Freemasonry, to experience the degrees themselves is because it's essentially because gnosis is experiential, right? Like you have to have the actual experience. You can't read your way into gnosis. The Gnostics were quite clear that like you can't intellectualize yourself. Like how many Platonists initially thought that you could intellectualize through intellect and philosophy, you could rationalize your way into higher states of consciousness, higher levels of consciousness, and eventually apotheosis. But that's not. But the Gnostics said no. You have to have certain experiences. You have to actually do certain meditations and rituals in order to have experiences that give you gnosis. And so that's what the Masonic light is. That's what the degrees are. It's essentially like, imagine that you studied the orange. Let's say that your entire life all you did was study the orange, and you wrote books. You've read every single book that has ever described oranges to you. You've watched thousands of hours of lectures on YouTube of orange, of what an orange fruit, what the fruit orange is, but you've never peeled and eaten the orange for yourself. You don't have gnosis about orange. You don't know. You're ignorant. You could be the world's leading expert on the orange, but you don't know jack shit about an orange because you've never peeled and eaten the orange. Once you've peeled and you've eaten the orange, you will have gnosis. You will understand what it is. That's what Masonic light is. It is literally forcing you to, by degrees, peel and eat the orange and savor the juice and be able to have a full-blown experience of what God or the orange is,
What about the people who claim to be self-initiated or promote this idea of self-initiation? Can you perform this work on yourself?
It's very difficult. It's not impossible, but even according to like the Vedas and things like that is a near Herculean, almost impossible task. It is literally like, yeah, if you're Hercules, if you're Achilles, if you're a hero, if you're a guru, if you're enlightened enough, if your past life experiences have alchemically made your spirit and your soul ready for that experience, you can do it on your own. You can do that. But let me just put it this way: Jesus himself wasn't even self-initiated. So
yes, he was initiated by John the Baptist.
Are you better than? Yeah. So it's like, so then I would ask, are you better than Jesus? Are you better than, even Buddha? Even Buddha received Diksha, and he was a seeker. Before the Buddha became the Buddha, he still had teachers. He still sought spiritual sadhus and spiritual wisdom. So there was still some kind of scaffolding. There was still something. He didn't just decide, okay, I'm leaving the palace sitting under a tree. There was more to the story. So he was still an initiate of like different mystery traditions and was taught the Vedas and was taught yoga and things before Buddha became the Buddha. So again, I would then ask somebody, do you really think that you're like, is your ego that fucking crazy that you think that you're better than Christ, that you think you're more enlightened than the Buddha? I
Mike,
don't know
if I would, I'm gonna use that on people. I will give you credit for it. I will give you credit for it, but I'm gonna use that on people from now on.
So, and let me put it this way, like, for example, like there's other things that you can self-initiate into, like, like ceremonial magic. You can technically, with enough work, you can actually do the Golden Dawn stuff by yourself and things like that. Again, it's really the will of the practitioner. If it's your will to be initiated into something, and if there's one thing that a perennialist or anybody will tell you, most seasoned occultists will tell you that all of these different paths, even extreme devotion within like something as dogmatic and rigid as Catholicism, right? You have these nuns that have these priests and like these different saints that have had ecstatic visions of gnosis.
Yes.
They've had Gnostic experiences, and later on, they're usually, if they haven't, after they've already probably been executed or whatever, eventually the Catholic Church goes, oh, you know what? Our bad. They were actually an enlightened being. We're gonna give them sainthood. like one of my favorite stories is like von Hildebrand or whatever, the one who that musical and artistic, probably autistic nun who received ecstatic visions and
Hildebert von
has
Bingen
some of the that's right, yeah. And so
or Hildegard.
somebody like that, so every tradition has a way of achieving gnosis if it's really truly your heart's desire. That's why it's kind of a common phrase in Freemasonry is that you were made a Mason in your where were you first made a Mason? In your heart. You were first made a Mason in your heart before you ever even knocked on the door of a Masonic lodge. And that's because, again, like this aspect of the will or really dharma and destiny, this idea that you were like destined, it's like, hey, like you were destined to become a Freemason, and that's why you are one. You were destined to become a yogi, and that's why you are one. You were destined to become a Sufi, and that's why you are one. You are destined to become the Christ, and that's why you are one. So it's like, if it's really important to you, you can self-initiate into certain paths. I think certain egregores are a little easier to tap into. That's one thing that a lot of people don't really even consider is like the egregore that is part of like what it is that they're joining. Some egregores are a little bit more easy to get in touch with and to tap into and to become part of. And some egregores are a little bit more strict, a little bit different. And so I would say that self-initiated Masonry is tough because the degrees in of themselves require a certain amount of people, because it's like a play. You're experiencing almost just like the rites of Mithras or something. You need a couple different actors to make the degree happen. So to be self-initiated in a Masonry, I would say technically impossible because like you have because it requires like these certain rituals and rites.
So your take,
but to be initiated into mysteries, that's a little different.
So your take is that the experience that you're getting post-initiation and the transformation that you're going through cannot be received. I'm talking about the experience, not about the ritual per se. I'm talking about the end result of what happens to you. You cannot gain that on your own.
Oh, no, actually, I would say that you can achieve gnosis. You can achieve certain levels of gnosis on your own without necessarily being initiated. It's a lot harder. It could be much, much more difficult. That's going to come with its own struggles, right? Like, most alchemists are, solo practitioners, but even they need like, for the master to kind of show up. There's all these, anytime that you read alchemical lore, they always say, oh yeah, and then this master came in and he sprinkled a little transmutation powder into my solution, and it transmuted. It did exactly what I needed. So the master, essentially the wizard, shows up when he's needed, when it's absolutely necessary. God will send the Hierophant to you in some way, you know what I mean? And again, we usually need at least like that's why I joined a Golden Dawn temple myself. When I was doing ceremonial magic on my own, I would have these experiences, these visions and stuff, but I had no way of grounding that with other people's experiences. And so for me, I needed to have like a mentor. So when I finally had my Golden Dawn temple, they actually give you a particular, depending on which grade you're in, they gave you a mentor that is assigned to that grade. And it was wonderful. It still is. I love every couple months, chatting with my mentor in order to tell him, hey, these are some experiences that I have, even, sharing some things from like my journal and things. And he can kind of give me he will literally just sit there silent for most of the phone call, but then say one or two sentences that blow my mind wide open. It's the salt in the water, as it will, that catalyst, which, it's like I would have probably gotten there. Eventually the water would have boiled. I would have reached that level. But having a mentor, having someone who's an adept, who's been there, done that, it's nice. It's very, very helpful. It's really, really good to have those things. If you can do it without it, then that's fine. But I mean, it's very hard. Really nice to have.
I agree with you. Everybody needs a Christian Rosenkreuz in their life.
Yes,
for sure.
Oh, 100%.
You mentioned you practice the Golden Dawn system of magic. In which lineage are you working in regards to the Golden Dawn? Because after the original order was dissolved, it split into multiple branches. So I'm curious to ask you about that as well. It's very rare that one gets to talk with somebody who actually practices Golden Dawn. So I want you to get into that a little bit.
You know, I've wanted to like ask my the Hierophant and and some of the adepts of like, oh, like what is our particular lineage? But every time that I've gotten together, we're obviously doing different rituals and things like that, and so I haven't been able to really get super in depth. But I do know from because they ended up they tried doing like a little podcast with like some of the guys, some of the people, not guys, the people from my temple. And one of the things that was kind of brought up was that most California Golden Dawn temples are technically from Israel Regardie, because Regardie was out here. Like Regardie lived out here. And so most Golden Dawn temples, especially in California, are going to say that their lineage stems from Regardie most of the time. So I don't know if that's the case with my particular lineage, because I do try not to get too lost in the weeds with certain things like that, like a particular lineage, because again, if that's literally the only reason that you're going to be a part of a system, that's a pretty, that I would say that whole thing is built on a house of cards. One small breeze and that whole fucking thing's coming down, because humans are extremely fallible and things like that. The whole point is if the system in and of itself works, and so like when I was considering doing like OTO or OTA or these other groups, I noticed that the quality, in a very polite way, I would like to say that the quality of these people's lives was not something that I would want in my own life. Not because it wasn't all rainbows and sunshine. I fully understand that spirituality and the spiritual path especially is anything but that. But there's a difference between, your life being very difficult because you're going through an alchemical process and being an asshole and being a creep and all these different things. So the spiritual fruit just like wasn't there in a lot of these other organizations. A lot of people with like addiction issues and all these other different things. So that's why I didn't go OTO OTA, and I went towards this Golden Dawn, because everybody that's a part of my temple is very well grounded and is is successful, but also not greedy, not prideful. The egos are extremely well managed, because even if you reach certain levels of enlightenment, you're still going to have like that lower ego that is like, make sure that you wipe your butt and brush your teeth and take a shower and all you at least need that aspect of your ego.
It's all about living a balanced life. It's
Yes.
partaking into the
Yes.
matrix, not rejecting the matrix, accepting your presence here and your current condition and making the best out of
Yeah.
it while you're still here. That's what I say to a lot of people, because when when most people discover Gnosticism, the first instinct is to reject materiality, to have like this very aggressive perspective towards being incarnated. You hate being here, but
Escapism is like the
it's like
thing.
levels of spiritual enlightenment, and at the final stage you realize you're part of the matrix and you are here for a purpose, perhaps to make an alchemical operation and eventually leave this place when you are ready. The soul, I mean, leaves the place when it is ready. Other than that, you may reincarnate all over again while still hating matter, because you're doing it
Of
yourself,
course.
because you're not ready to leave it. So it's all about what Manly Palmer Hall called the transmutation of attitudes and understanding these things. So interesting. Now, one thing you mentioned, you said that lineage does not matter too much to you, but because people are fickle. I agree with that. But the reverse is that if you don't work in a lineage, then it can also be bad for you, because the practice may not be legitimate. Now, a seasoned person who actually knows esotericism and reads will realize that quite early.
Sure.
So you will not be in danger in that situation. But for people getting into it, neophytes, like being beginners in the field, it's important to, in my opinion, at least, it's important to practice in a place, or to join an order which is legitimate, or at least has some credentials, because this way you
Sure.
at least have something to ground your practice into. You have
Sure.
some roots. It's not about other people coming and saying, "Oh, you're not practicing into my lineage. You're not as cool and badass as I am." It's not about that. It's just about being in a safe place, and
Yeah.
having good teachers there. So I'm not saying it can happen in places that are not as grounded or don't have deep roots. I'm just saying that it's important for people to have discernment when they join secret societies or discrete organizations, because people ask me this question a lot. Alex, which secret order should I join? Should I join Freemasonry? Should I join AMORC? Should I join OTO? And I always say, I don't answer to these questions directly. I just say, do your own research, go to a place that you feel called to. If you have somebody there that you know and you trust, you can talk with them. You can look at the quality of the people who are part of these organizations, because nowadays all of them have people who create content for these organizations and stuff like that. So just look at the overall quality of the people, and you can measure things based on that. Because if you go and ask about lineage, most people will not even answer that. They will not take you seriously, because you're like, oh, you're here for the pedigree, which is not really about that,
Yeah.
I mean, I think when Israel Regardie published the works, when he published the Golden Dawn documents, that was the whole point. To destroy this castle that was built, to tear down these walls that were built.
Yeah. Well, and ironically, he did take up students, and he did, so he still had his own, he still had his own, his again, he was very active, and that's why he's buried in Hollywood cemeteries, because he's, he was very active out here in California. But yeah, to a degree, lineage is also very good. One thing I will definitely agree with is that lineage can be also important, again, when you're trying to discern, like, essentially, again, the egregore that you're going to be bound to and worked with. Like, a lot of people don't really think about the fact that, when you decide to take up a lineage, you are going to be now tied to an actual spiritual entity. People, the aspect and the understanding of egregores is unfortunately very, very, it's just not very widely spoken of, or if it is, it's just like a fun one-off topic or lecture, but people really don't take into consideration the gravity of being bound to an egregore, because again, the egregore, once you're bound to it through an initiation, if it's unhealthy, it is also going to affect your practice. So I do agree with you in that instance that lineage is important, because the egregore that you're being attached to is something that you want to make sure that you're comfortable with it, and that you're going to, and then also that you're going to keep it sustained, because you could have a really, really good egregore and healthy egregore, but through the ages, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker, like if you're a Greek Hellenist to this day, if you're a modern, if you're trying to practice, ancient Greek, Hellenic ritual practice, that's a very weak egregore, because it just hasn't been, it hasn't been around for so long. It's probably a very starved, weak egregore, so in order for you to build that back up, it's going to take an insane amount of work, which can be good if your subtle body can handle that, good for you, but it could also be very, very, very dangerous. So yeah, the egregore that you're tapping into is something you want to, and that's even within Freemasonry. I think that even it's not intentional, but we tell people to shop around. We really, really emphasize, like, hey, if you're looking into a lodge, or if you're looking to join Freemasonry, don't just visit one lodge. Visit as many lodges as within your area, even if you have to travel an extra 20, 30 minutes, you don't want to just go for the nearest lodge that happens to be down the street or closest to you.
Of course.
You want to find the lodge that is going to have the same, again, going to have a healthy egregore. Because, again, my mother lodge, I'll never be able to raise anybody in my mother lodge, in the original lodge that I was a part of. And for me to establish myself with this new lodge, excuse me, it was it was a long process. It was like, now that I think about it, establishing myself with and with the egregore of Whittier 323, it took work. It took some time to be able to essentially disconnect myself from my old
And
lodge and
integrate
myself into this new lodge. Yeah. So, you know,
But what about when you're joining Freemasonry? You are tapping into an egregore as well. Um, what who rules this egregore? What god?
well, again, the ideal is that it's directly connected to the one, but and so this egregore would in and of itself be directly connected to things like Kabbalah and things like that. So ideally, it would be connected to, for a lot of people, it would be an Abrahamic God. For me, it's not. For me, it has greatly transcended that. And again, that's also because I've participated in ritual where we don't have a holy Bible, the altar. We have like the book of, we have like the Zoroastrian text. The what is it called? The Azendavesta. So like
Yes.
I've been in ritual where we've done that. I've been in ritual where we used sutras, different like Buddhist sutras instead, or even the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Like I've been in lodges where we've had many, like where there was one time where there was a brother who had like the Nag Hammadi, and like he had like, it was like a stack of like 6 or 7 different books on the altar, which was pretty cool, which was a really, really, cool
That's
thing to
absolutely
experience.
based.
So yeah, so I mean, personally, for most lodges, I believe that they're probably closer aligned to like the egregore of the Abrahamic God. But from my experience, at least from most of the lodges here in Southern California, because of the amount of immigration, the amount of immigrants that we have, it's an extremely diverse. It's an extremely diverse group of men. Extremely diverse. Like
Mike, I don't
it's
have a
very
problem
rare
with
you're gonna
that.
have all white lodges. You know what I mean?
I don't have a
So
problem with that, and hear me out, because I'm gonna say something controversial, but I don't care.
please.
I don't understand why people get fixated so much on the Old Testament, because this is not about rejecting God. It's about understanding God, and which God are we talking about? Because if you study the Old Testament, personally, I don't think it aligns with my values at all, and I don't think it will align with a lot of values that Jesus Christ will share. So I find it quite ironic that there are so many Christians out there who say Freemasonry is satanic. They're not using Bibles in the lodges. First of all, some Freemasons don't use Bibles in the lodges, and second of all, what do you say of the Old Testament, which was basically written during during the exile of the Jewish people into
In Babylon,
Persia,
yeah.
into Persia. So the Old Testament heavily draws on Zoroastrian lore. Even the angelology of the Old Testament draws from that, and even from the Epic of Gilgamesh and from Mesopotamian lore. So it's not even the oldest writing that we have, and it's not even that authentic, to be honest. I'm sorry, but I think Christians should do a better, especially the evangelical Christians should do a better research on that, because if they do it, they will realize all the flaws in the Old Testament. It's a really problematic writing, not only because of how it was written and when it was written, but also because what's in there. In fact, I will actually argue that most Christians don't even read the Bible, because if you read it, you start to question if Yahweh is actually a tyrant. Now, I want to ask you, because uh, this is my perspective, at least. I'm not agnostic. I don't think Gnosticism is the cure to the spiritual crisis that we're in. I'm more of a Neoplatonist. I'm more aligned with that, honestly. But I also want to ask you personally if you think the God of the Old Testament is a tyrant, because I share that perspective.
I believe that there's many gods that are pictured in the Old Testament, because if you consider like the creation story, there's a distinction between the Elohim
They didn't
and
survive. They didn't survive,
yeah.
Mike, in the Old Testament. It's alluded to in the Old Testament. It's the plural is used. Of course, I know that the original God of the Old Testament, of the original patriarchs, was El. It was not Yahweh. I know that. I'm very much aware of it. But the thing is that it didn't survive in the Old Testament, and people don't understand that. So I find it quite problematic that suddenly Yahweh becomes this, especially if you consider the latest archaeological findings when it comes to Asherah and the fact that other deities of the people of Israel were in fact competing for this role of El. In fact, El is part of the name Israel. So
Right.
I don't know. In my opinion, it's quite strange that people don't realize that. And I'm sorry for interrupting you. Go ahead.
No.
But I just wanted to give the context for that. That I'm very much aware of it.
Yeah, and I mean, even in like, for example, in Kabbalah, right? Like, El is actually attributed to as a god name. So, like, essentially, there's this idea that how do I put this? I definitely believe that a lot of Kabbalists eventually, like, I think that it's been around for quite some time that, and this is with any priesthood, it's not exclusive even just to Judaism, because when you study, for example, like Indian, like the development of religion in the Indian subcontinent, regarding, again, like, when you look at Brahmanism, which is essentially like the priest class, but then you also have the Vaishnavas, Shaivas, these different Suryas. You have like all these different sects, right? And so it's this idea that at the I think that most of the time, what you're going to find, because I'm a perennialist, so I think that at the end of the day, like, even the most devout, keepers of Judaism believe that there is a transcendent one, nameless God, right? But they have chosen to give to the people an exoteric God that they feel is going to be the strongest egregore to bind their society to. And so I think that they were smart enough in order to be like, hey, like we're specifically going to use the storm god because it's about conquest. And so I think that I'm sure that the ancient, Abraham, these priests, I'm sure that they were smart enough to know, hey, we're going to tap into this specific energy. And so that is the energy that you're seeing permeate throughout the Bible, is this storm god, this Canaanite deity, essentially, that was hijacked and turned into and that actually happened also in India with Shiva. So initially, before there was Shiva, there was Ruga or whatever, and he is a storm god. He's a storm deity. Same thing with in Nordic, when you have, you have the All-Father Odin, but then you have Thor. Then you have like this emphasis on Thor, not the father, right? So it's that happens so often where like we essentially say, yes, we acknowledge that there's this All-Father, that there's this absolute monad, but we're not focused on that. We're I think that at one point we used to be very comfortable with saying, I don't want that, I want this energy. And so El is Chesed, which is like supposed to be this divine mercy. It's supposed to be like Santa Claus. And that's where you get like the big, white bearded Yahweh kind of a figure, unfortunately.
Yes, Mike, but Thor in the Norse mythology is the god of the warrior. Is the god who wages war on behalf of Odin. Odin is the All-Father. He commands the other gods. He's like
that's my
puppet master. He's the puppet master. But in Christianity, I find it quite strange that my grandmother goes to the church and prays to a god of war. I find it quite strange because most people, most Christians, imagine God as a wise old man in the sky who is all loving, who is who judges people, based on their merits and stuff like that. But then when you read the Bible and you also read the Gnostic Gospels, which are now starting to be accepted as canon, again, I'm not agnostic, but I'm just saying, then you start to realize that there's something wrong. I know this is controversial. I know this will trigger a lot of people, but there must be something wrong with the three Abrahamic religions, because they are all based on this deity. And if you read the Old Testament, you have God trapping Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That sounds very demiurgic to me. That sounds like the architect of the Matrix from the movie. That sounds to me like that. Then you have a God testing Abraham's faith by almost making him kill his own son. I don't know what kind of God does that. Then you have God basically prompting Cain to kill Abel because of jealousy. Then you have the same God commanding mass murders into Egypt. And I don't want to get into today's politics. I'll let people figure out the rest. But in my opinion, I think belief in this deity is not helping the collective evolution of humanity, and is definitely not a force of unity. As much as Christianity is about loving each other and being more empathetic with the people around us, being generous, I'm all for that. Jesus Christ is king. I'm all for that. But then I find this sits in contradiction with what the Old Testament says, and I think this must be discussed more online. I know a lot of people are afraid to do it. I'm not afraid to do it, and even if there's gonna be a lot of people in the comments saying, because I also find this on my post on Instagram as well, which is wild. Embrace Jesus Christ to refute Satan. Guys, I just said that Jesus Christ is king, and I also, Mike, I receive emails from Christians saying these things to me, and I don't understand why. Because, for all intents and purposes, I'm actually trying to tell people the truth. I know this is not a popular position, being I don't want to call myself truth seeker. I think that's cringe, but I'm trying to. At least that's my intention, to spread as much truth as possible based on what we have currently, because there is still research being done, there's still archaeological investigations being done, so new discoveries will be made. But I just tell people, don't be so rigid, be flexible, be like water, my friend. Study a little bit, read the primary sources, read the primary text, and see what's in there, because this is not about Freemasons being satanic. It's not about Agrippa's diary promoting a narrative. It's just about encouraging people to read and come to their own conclusions, and then maybe we can have these discussions happening even in the more mainstream sources, in the mainstream sources of information. So I wanted to have your perspective on that as well, and I hope you were able to clarify. If not, you can feel free to add more to this conversation. If you can, because this conversation turned out to be longer than I expected. So if you have more time left, please say so. If no, we can wrap this up.
I do.
Okay,
no,
perfect.
not at all. When it comes to the Old Testament, I think that one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the Bible was not written for us, for lay folk. It was, when we number one, people didn't even know how to read primarily. For most of human history, most people have not had the ability to read, and so everything was essentially kept to the priest class, who were essentially treated like aristocracy for most of human history, or like held with some reverence and respect, and so that it was up to them. The Bible was written for kings by kings, essentially. It is not meant to be taken, number one, absolutely literal. There are parts of it that are meant to be historical. This person did this. This person went to war with this. We killed these people and assimilated into this. So there's some historical aspects to the Bible, but there's also these certain aspects that are meant to be allegorical, and they're meant to be taken as an allegory for us. That's why even Jesus himself spoke in parables and allegory, and he only spoke directly to the innermost. Not even all 12 disciples got like the juice from Jesus. Even in one of the Gnostic Gospels, I believe is the Gospel of Thomas, Peter gets all butthurt because Mary Magdalene is actually given specific esoteric instruction, and he says, "Why the hell are you allowed to like have that?" And she's like, "Well, because I'm his consort. I am his, essentially, paraphrasing myself, I'm his Shakti." he's Shiva, I'm Shakti. I am the divine feminine aspect of the Christ, and so of course he's going to confide in me. She's even just like I think it was like a few years ago, the Catholic Church finally canonized Mary Magdalene as the disciple of all disciples. The most even though originally John was considered the most loved, he who Christ most loved, but that is even kind of a Gnostic, certain aspects of Gnostic sects actually also kind of had their own weird sexist things. Not all Gnostics were comfortable
Yes.
with the divine masculine and feminine, or if they did have the divine feminine, it was still this subdued, submissive spirit, Sophia. It's not meant to be as equally as powerful as God, as the patriarch. So, but in some sects that I feel like were closer to the truth, it was that these were exactly par and parcel, step in hand. And so I think that the Old Testament, it's hard for people, for laity, to distinguish. And that's also why I almost feel like it was made, like, even though it's great that the Gutenberg press, and we were able to mass circulate the Bible, because of that, we have evangelists, we have all of these Christians online who are essentially evangelist or Protestant or whatever, who essentially believe, hey, like, the more people that I convert to Christianity by essentially telling them repent or die, or like you're going to hell, they really do believe that it's their job. They're taught, and they're conditioned, especially in America, they are taught to proselytize as much as humanly possible. Even going as far as, in America, my girlfriend and I were at the grocery store, and somebody gave us a like one of those fake $100 bills, and on the back it said, oh, it's like worth more than money, Jesus. So like, and it's like, convert, and then, but it's not just like explore Jesus or find Jesus. It's come to our church, come to our place and tithe and give us money, and that whole thing. So I think that, again, like, it wasn't necessarily a great thing. As great as it was, it's kind of the same thing with Israel Regardie, right? There's even like some occultists today who are like, hey, as great as it was that Regardie exposed all this, and that like occultism is becoming more readily available, it's just like the serpent in the garden we talked about earlier. It comes with its own negatives as well. Like unfortunately, the dilution of some of this wisdom and
Yes,
the
but
misunderstanding of this wisdom.
do you think
So
that the true teachings of Jesus were basically were overshadowed by this by the Old Testament?
I think that particular emphasis, because the Old Testament is literally just a larger portion of the Bible. So I think
Yes.
that, when you look at all these pastors, where are they going to start? They're going to start in they're going to start in Genesis and work their way through the Bible as they study. And so what happened, if you've ever read a big book, sometimes you get like this malaise, you get like this, you get a little tired. So by the time that you're at the end, you're just kind of like, okay, well, here we go. We're just going through. And so a particular emphasis has been on the Old Testament also, because at the end of the day, Jesus was not trying to start his own religion. He was actually trying to, he was specific. He was a Jew. He was literally talking to his people. He had no intention whatsoever of bringing Gentiles into the mix, because in my opinion, Jesus was a perennialist, and he likely saw that, hey, the Indian sadhu who bathes in the Ganges is the same as the person who's being baptized in the Jordan. You know what I mean? That's the same ritual. That's the same rite. I'm sure that he saw that all of these beautiful mystic paths lead to God, lead to this one place. That's why he had such a particular emphasis on the Father. It was a father aspect, like, oh, he's my father. It's this aspect of like bhakti, devotion to the one Father, rather than anything else. Again, he doesn't say to a storm god. He doesn't even say Yahweh. He literally says Abba, which is Father. He really never mentions Yahweh. And so, yeah, and so to me, but at the end of the day, I think that Christ also understood who his audience was, who essentially like what kind of prophet, who he was a prophet to. I don't think that Jesus saw himself as a prophet to anybody but the Jews, and he was there in order to obviously be able to participate in the Tikkun Olam and the reparation of that particular sect of people, that particular group of people, and in that age and that time. And so everything that Jesus talks about, all of the allegories that he has, why doesn't he talk about elephants and monkeys? Because that's not where he's from. He's not talking to people who live somewhere else. He is talking
Of
to the
course.
Jews. He is talking to them. And so I think that that's why the particular emphasis on the Old Testament is there, is because Jesus himself was a Jew. So people are just like, hey, like in order for me to
Yes, but
understand
the
Jesus,
Jews
I have to
rejected.
understand this.
I get it, but the Jews rejected Jesus. So then,
not all
if
of them.
Christian,
Most of the first disciples were all Jewish. You know what I mean? Like the very first Christian churches, they were made of
I
Jews,
agree.
not Gentiles.
I agree, some of them, but then if you look at
hundreds of years later,
hundreds of years later, then it's
that
not
changed.
true. That changed.
Right.
And today, if you look at the statistics, I don't know, man. So I don't want to get into that, but just saying.
Okay.
Just saying.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I don't believe that Jesus. I don't think that Jesus wanted
I find it
religion.
shady that I find it shady. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I find it weird that somehow the Old Testament became more important than the actual teachings of Jesus. I find it interesting, and I also find it interesting that monarchs in Europe studied this, because you said it was made for kings. Why did they study the Old Testament? For what purpose? Anyway, I guess we need. I understand that you need a moral framework in which you can work, and in some cases, the Old Testament does a great job of that.
Yeah,
but
10 Commandments, the whole shebang.
But
those
ultimately,
aren't bad recommendations.
Yes, but it's also a big part of it. It's about vengeance and war and jealousy, and it's quite strange. Now,
it's the history of how they conquered, how they essentially kicked out the Canaanites and kicked out everybody else and said, "This is my land now." That's essentially what it comes down to.
Yes. I wanted to make a joke, but I will not. Now, I think you read my mind there. Now, I want to ask you, because we're discussing Jesus right now, and
yes,
this is gonna be one of the last questions that we do today. Honestly, man, this is the first time we are chatting. Disclosure for everybody who's watching. This is the first time I'm chatting with Mike, but we're vibing. We're really vibing. I think we exchanged a few messages before. I just found your post extremely interesting, and you're always leaving great comments on my posts.
Thank you, brother.
So I had to talk with you, and I wanted to do this raw like this, and it was amazing so far. I love the vibes, and we'll definitely do a second episode if you're down.
100%.
If you're down for it.
Absolutely, man. Thank you.
But one of the last questions that I want to ask you is if you think that Jesus was actually the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
It's a good question.
Because we see the serpent on the cross in Masonic symbolism as well.
Yes.
So
that's correct. Yeah, the brazen serpent. It's like it's actually one of my favorite symbols. I have this business that I'm starting out here called Sacred Traditions, and actually as part of my logo is the serpent wrapped around the Tau cross. And so, because ST worked out. Anyway, I think that I definitely believe that, again, these things are allegorical, so I don't believe like that a real serpent existed in a garden and all of these things. I believe in the symbol in and of itself, and I do believe that the brazen serpent that was erected by Moses was in its own way a symbolic Christophany. This idea of like look upon this image and ye shall be healed. And so Christ is the same way. You look upon his image, his example of how he lived his life, and you shall be healed. That's what he came for, was salvation, was to save us was to allow us to be able to live within this world, but also not live in ignorance, but live live in light and wisdom, which ultimately creates a more fulfilling life. You're still going to experience suffering, just as Christ experienced suffering, but ultimately it is the path of liberation from suffering is what I really truly believe that most mystery traditions are trying to do. Because again, we get this, this soul gets this incarnation, only once. The soul is going to incarnate however many times, but this is our experience right now. Here we are. And I think that that's what spirituality is meant for, is to be able to give us the most happy, healthy, and fulfilling life. So I believe that the power, ultimately, number one, everything is one. So the same force that emanated the Christ emanated the serpent. The same that same ground of awareness, of absolute total awareness and totality that is God, manifested the serpent, it manifested the scorpion, it manifested Christ, it manifested Buddha, it manifested all these things. So I believe that the Christos, it all comes from that same place. So if that's what the serpent in the garden was this aspect of illumination and revelation in order to usher in a new state of consciousness and to initiate us into a new state of consciousness, then yes, I would agree. But ultimately, everything, in my opinion, comes from this one thing and emanates from this one thing. So
Yes, they are
really,
just.
it's like, yes, the excrement is just as much a part of me as the sun is a part of me.
Mike, you're really an alchemist. That's a very alchemical perspective on things. And I believe for myself that what happened in the Garden of Eden, first of all, I will say it's an allegory 100%. There was no such thing as an original garden, obviously, but it's an allegory. And I believe it was an alchemical operation, what happened there. And I think our lives are an alchemical operation. What I will say, because you said all of it emanates from the one, yes, but there are secondary or third causes. And these things, I'm more aligned with Martinists when it comes to this. And the doctrine of reintegration of Pasquale, I find it particularly interesting. Again, I don't take it as dogma, I take it as allegory, but it offers an interesting perspective on such things. So thank you for being open and answering to this question. I know a lot
Absolutely.
of people. I know a lot of people will not do that. But what I also find interesting about the serpent in the Garden of Eden is that in the Gnostic lore, he is sent there by Sophia, who is a virgin because she's the only Eon who creates without her consort, and Jesus is also born of a virgin. That's also an interesting thing to mention. And you said before you're a perennialist. Uh, I like perennialism a lot, but I believe people don't really understand what this word means because they believe perennialism is just dissolving the value of the individual culture of different people. And maybe can you explain what being a perennialist means and what it means to have a perennialist view of the world and of religions
Sure.
and of spirituality? Because it's
Yeah,
aligned with
I've always.
Masonic philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, like, otherwise we wouldn't be able to break bread with all different kinds of people, right? It would be like Masonry would be exclusive to a particular religious belief. It would be, but it's not. That's the beautiful thing about Masonry, and probably I would argue the thing that, like, if people want to call Masonry heretical, that's what makes us heretical. Is that the fact that, like, we can break bread with all different religions. We can all come together and enjoy and appreciate these allegories, these stories. We can also get together and work towards a common alchemical, result, in our own lives, which is to be better, which is to be just better people in general, which in and of itself is essentially all that spirituality and religion is there for. Ideally, is to make us better and to make it to where humans can work well and better together. And so I think that perennialism is this idea that there is a clear white light, that essentially this golden thread, if you will, that goes through all religion, and every religion and everything is trying to achieve this specific end, and that you could essentially distill everything down. If you were to burn away all the dross and all the pageantry and all the dogma and all these different things, you will eventually reach the same conclusion. And so that's what perennialism essentially is. And so perennialists love comparative religion. We love to look at all different kinds of religions, and I think that there is a misunderstanding that people assume that just because you're a perennialist, you don't acknowledge distinction. And that's not true. Just like how a non-dualist essentially can look and say, yes, there is dualism in this world. There is pleasure and there is pain. There is like these, there is white and black. There's the suns, but there's also the vast void that is between them. Like all of these different things are acknowledged by the non-dualist. And so a perennialist is essentially this person that does believe that essentially within all religion there is a particular wisdom tradition, what could be considered like the this one truth. That's what Blavatsky really was focusing on or honing in on, was this idea of this perennial philosophy, that all religions essentially have like this one, there is no religion higher than truth, at the end of the day. And so that
Manly
essentially is
Palmer
like
Hall as
the
well.
perennialist. Yeah. Oh, certainly for him, Aldous Huxley, all these people, they're all perennialists. And again, once you reach a certain level of priesthood, they eventually kind of become, most Catholic priests that I know, if they're, I've met some very, some relatively high up, clergy members in my time being, here in Southern California. You meet all kinds of people. And I've also met some really, really adept Eastern meditators and different, gurus and things like that. And again, all these people, like once you get to a certain level, they all are like, when the laity is away, right? When the congregation is not here, they all can get together, over a little bit of, blessed wine and say, we're all on the same page. We all get it, especially in this day and age. And I think that that's what Christ kind of did, whether he realized it or not. And that's why even those certain aspects of his message have made it into certain aspects of Christianity, just not with the laity, because it's easier to keep people divided. It's easier to keep the exoteric over here and the esoteric over here. But when you get together with pastors and priests and all these different people, and you're just like, when everything's closed off and everything's secret, which is the great thing about Masonry, is that it provides this space where like you can kind of get together and be like, hey, like we all are on the same page, right? Like you might be Muslim, you might be, Hindu, I might be raised Christian, but we're all on the same boat, right? Or we're all feeling the same thing. And we go, yeah, absolutely. Again, like Indians will sit there and be like, oh, like just as Christ was a solar deity, we have, Surya, who's our solar deity. So it's like all these different ways that we can come together and talk about the same thing. So that's essentially what I would say perennialism is this idea that, I love the diversity of all the different religions, but ultimately we're all going towards the same place. We're all walking each other home, so to speak.
Oh, yeah. I resonate with that a lot, but I'm sure that the religious fundamentalists who practice the Abrahamic religions will disagree with that.
Oh, of course, because it has to be only their one, they're only their one way and only their one truth and only their one path of life that must be, and everybody else who's ever existed in this universe, which is, billions and billions and billions of star systems, which with other sentient life, I'm sure, but we're just going to pretend that we got it all figured out. My one pastor has it all figured out. Like, what craziness.
I'm curious if one day it is proven that alien exists, what happens with those of us who believe we are the chosen ones and that we are special in the eyes of God? I wonder what happens then. Are you going to be more special than aliens? I don't know. that's gonna be and
Dogma is a tough one, man. I mean, like people will see the truth straight in front of them and will bury it deep down and pretend that they just didn't see it. You know what I mean? Like
that's why
I think it would take generations. It would take hundreds. You know, that's why a platonic cycle is like what, like 2,500 years or how, like 2,556 or how, whatever a platonic cycle, whatever astrological age is. You know, it takes that long. You know, usually for that ideal and those virtues from that particular zodiac to really manifest into that age, you know, and we're right now just getting, you know, transferring from the Piscean age to the Aquarian age. So we're very, you know, we're still babies in this new age. So, but, you know, hey, like another 500 years from now, who knows? You know, we could be, you know,
Mike, there's a big
well.
question. There's a big question if we are going to be here in 500 years at the rate things are evolving, and considering that, in my opinion, we should be at a mature level. We have the means to connect with each other. We have the means to
100%.
exchange ideas, to have dialogues. This is what this podcast is all about. So I still find it strange that we are not able to mature and grow up from this state where we have to fight with each other. Because I believe my God is the original God, and yours is not. And I believe I don't hate the player; I hate the game. You know, because I know most of these people have been raised like this. They're not to blame. I don't carry any hatred in my heart for them, but I don't understand why they're not open to conversation. Maybe they are trapped. Maybe their religion does not allow them to communicate such things, and maybe they are afraid. I don't understand what's going on, but it's important to, as a human, if you are not free to contemplate your own thoughts and have your own opinion and form your own view of the world, and be able to apply moral teachings uniformly for all people around you, then I think you have failed as a human being, and I believe you're gonna be cursed to an endless cycle of damnation and reincarnation. Maybe this is actually what it means to maybe this is hell, you know, to experience such things, and maybe liberation is just being filled with love and trying to be a positive thing in this world, because all of us, we are here for a limited amount of time. We don't know how much time we have. We don't know if we're going to live to see tomorrow. So while we are here, at least let's try to be decent with each other, you know, and listen to each other and exchange ideas, and just don't try to create friction, you know. I don't understand why we can't mature into, because this is not even such a complicated alchemical operation, in my opinion. It should be easy, right? I don't understand why it's so hard to be a decent.
It's pretty
to be
hard.
A decent person.
It's pretty hard. Yeah, to love your enemy as you love yourself is probably is definitely one of the most difficult things that we can do, and I think it's part of like the backside of the coin of Luciferian light that we were talking about, where like there's illumination, but then also there's what was the thing that, you know, they say also corresponded to Lucifer, Prometheus's intentions with why he did what he did was pride, ego, you know. And so like one of the biggest things that we have going against us is this is over identifying with the ego rather than the soul, you know. And so when you're identified with your soul, loving your enemy as you love yourself is no problem, because it's the same thing. You don't even, when you have that level of consciousness of you know, you don't even see your enemy as your enemy. You see them literally as yourself, and
an
so
aspect of
it
yourself.
becomes exactly. And so, oh no, quite literally, I mean, like even farther. Like you see them as yourself. Where if I stab you, I'm stabbing myself. You know what I mean? Like
that's how I see things. 100%.
That level. Yeah, so like that, when you have that level and it's integrated and it's a part of your practice, that's a pretty big working in and of itself. And so I think that that's like probably the biggest working that we have. Now, once you reach that, then you're on the path towards adepthood, because once you've reached that, you know, if you're able to love others as you love yourself, that's an insane amount of work essentially already done, and now you're doing the work of the Christ, you know. So which would be
what's
very
interesting
impressive.
about this alchemical operation is that it's flawless. Like it works even against your ego, because if you're doing this from a selfish perspective to put yourself on a throne of righteousness, like, oh, I'm not hurting other people because they are me, I'm just here in my own bubble. I'm God experiencing itself, so I should be nice with everybody else. Of course, this is a very egotistical perspective, but it
Right.
even helps this perspective. It works with such an approach as well. So I don't know, it's just flawless in my opinion. It's just such a good thing
Yeah.
to do for yourself as a human being. But yeah, I feel like mainstream media nowadays, the news cycle, the politics, the culture wars are all feeding into this division that we are experiencing. And it's so easy to get caught up into it because people are watching content nowadays, and their favorite content creator has a political affiliation and a political opinion, and he has to stand with different tribes. When I think we are at the point where nobody's even right anymore. We don't know what is going on because there is so much history and context to take into consideration that the only solution is to just leave it all behind and just come from a fresh slate and put our ambitions behind, our personal or national ambitions behind, and just focus on like developing our economies and just trying to create conditions for everybody to thrive. We can do that. It's such a chill guy thing to do, I don't know why it's so complicated. I don't know why we have to get caught up into these things further, like I believed at
Yeah.
least the internet will solve part of it, but now it's turning into a force that amplifies them. But at the same time, we have the opportunities to have these conversations and these discussions, and I believe that is good because some people will watch it, and although the impact is much smaller than on other platforms, at least it is there. And maybe over generations, it will compound. Although I'm kind of a doomer in this regard because artificial intelligence, AGI is coming, bro. The mass surveillance state is coming. And some people say even Freemasonry is part of that. If you listen to Professor Jiang, I don't know about that, man. I think it's BS, but the mass surveillance state exists. I believe Palantir is doing it. I
Yeah.
don't believe Freemasonry is doing it. But, I believe people should focus on these things rather than on culture wars and try to push for sovereignty
Right.
more.
I definitely think that's a big thing. And, one thing that people forget is, you know, one of Masonry's biggest enemies historically has been essentially organized religion, but particularly the Catholic Church. You look at Cagliostro, who's one of my favorite examples, who was an alchemist who the Catholic Church essentially tortured into, tortured into professing that he was, this Giordano I forget like what they tried to say his real name was, but essentially Giuseppe Balsamo. They tried to, they essentially tortured him into essentially saying that he was that he was. But at the end of the day, when you really look at like what he was convicted of, it was being a Freemason because there was a Papa Bull literally days before he landed in Rome with his wife. There was a Papa Bull that banned Freemasonry that
Yeah.
essentially said that it was heretical for Catholics, and so that's what they essentially charged him with. And he was originally going to be executed, but then it's actually been proven that there was we don't know who it was, but somebody talked to the Pope and essentially convinced the Pope not to kill Cagliostro, and so Cagliostro was spared, and he had life imprisonment, which it was a very short and probably worse than death, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I think so.
Where he was, what he experienced, but so in my opinion, the greed class has always been kind of tied to when you look at the Vatican and you see the gilded gold and all of the information that they stole from indigenous people, especially regarding feminine or lunar traditions.
Yeah.
They really tried to strip the feminine out of the spiritual thing and made it completely patriarchal. And so I think one of the biggest, and I think that there's money to be made. I think that the main thing, the reason why that things are the way they are, is because the ruling class, what I like to call the greed class, because that's what they are. They're just stuck on greed and power and but mostly greed. the greed class benefits from us being divided. The greed class benefits on us essentially looking at having a dualistic mindset of you're other and I'm me and I'm an individual. And so they make more money on that, right? Like that if you have more things than the person next to you, you're doing better, you're doing good for yourself. You know what I mean? If you have a plaque and this person doesn't have a plaque, you're better than them. You know what I mean? So it's this idea of like of this dualistic mindset that the greed class benefits from that system. So once we essentially, if we were to abolish this greed class and we made it to where we weren't so worried about money, these biosurvival tickets that we call money, which is just fake, which is not real, based on nothing, fiat currency and things like that. Like once we've gotten rid of that, I feel like it would be so much easier for people to do almost like, for people who watch Star Trek and they live in like this like utopia on Earth now where like there's no war, everybody has clean water, everybody has, clean clothes, everybody has access to good food. It's like such a basic no duh thing that I think people will get, but it's the whole thing of like the greed aspect. This, I have to have a slightly better car than you, otherwise I'm not fulfilled. Once that's transcended, once we make it past that, then I do believe that we can have a much more equitable and fulfilling time here on Earth, enjoying the thing, eating delicious chocolate and looking at nature and all of those things,
Yeah, but
having
here's the
great
thing.
sex, having great food.
Here's the thing, Mike. There's a you say the money is nothing. I don't agree with that. I think money is energy, and I think money, fiat currency especially, is backed by our life force and our time. But
Right.
and I think there's an egregore around money as well, and a religion of money as well. But we'll get into that in another episode, because
Yes,
if we open this
absolutely.
discussion, then we're gonna take this to 3 hours, and people don't have attention spans for that. Like
No.
I was thinking during our conversation if I should upload this in multiple parts or not, but I think I'll just upload it like this raw and let it sit there, because it was
Joe
such a
Rogan can do
fascinating.
3 hours, so we can do 3 hours,
It was such a
If that
fascinating.
egghead.
It was such a fascinating conversation, and in the next episode,
Yes.
I will ask you about Jeffrey Epstein as well and the symbolism of his temple. If you want to get into that, will get a lot of views, I'm sure. If you want to discuss
It sure will. I'm 100% down. Absolutely.
Okay. Final question for you, Mike, before we wrap this up. Where do you see Freemasonry in 20, 30 years? And why do you think anybody should join a Masonic lodge? I'm not promoting Masonry, so people don't get me wrong, but I'm just giving you the opportunity as a Freemason to pitch that for people if you think it's worthy of their time.
Yes. So I will say, for a lot of people, I get asked a lot because people know that I do ceremonial magic and also do Masonry. They say, well, why even do Masonry? It just seems like a lot of pageantry, and it doesn't seem, if you're already doing the ceremonial magic thing and, and you're constantly talking about how Masonry alludes to Kabbalah and but you're doing something that actively uses all of these symbols. Why do this other thing? For me, I think that in 20 to 30 years, Masonry is going to, within the next 20 to 30 years, I think that there will be a revitalization of Masonry. That's if like totalitarian regimes don't end up taking over places like America, where there is predominant, because whenever you have tyranny, you generally will have the abolition of Masonry. Where there are tyrants and dictatorships, Masonry is completely underground. I get messages from brothers that are in, different countries, like especially in the Middle East, where they meet in secret, and at any point in time, if the government were to find out that they existed, they would all be executed. And their lodge burned to the ground. And because these lodges are generally either in caves or they're like or they're in the secret basements of people's homes, again, like this, it's still a very, very suppressed, group in these places. So if America and these different places, if the West falls to tyranny, you are going to find that Masonry could end up becoming more obscure. If the light prevails and people prevail and they're able to keep tyranny at bay, then Masonry will continue to grow, and I think we'll have a very positive influence, especially in regards to communities, because lodges do a lot in order to help their communities. We saw that during COVID-19, where lodges were handing out toilet paper and essentials. Culver City Lodge was giving out diabetic medication and aid, which was cool. So I definitely see Masonry just continuing the way that it is. I do see eventually, especially in California, because we accept, for example, like trans men, which is a very hot topic, you could say. We would, we do consider, if just because you were born, female, and if you transition to male, we do accept that you can become a Freemason and in regular Grand Lodge Freemasonry. But also, I see the growth of women that are interested in Masonry, and co-Masonry is also growing out here as well. And so, I would love, I don't care if in 20 or 30 years, if the fraternity is still male dominated and only certain irregular lodges are co-Masonic. I would like to see more. I also personally wouldn't mind if in 20 or 30 years women were allowed, or essentially anybody non-binary. I don't care if you identify as a cupcake. If you want to seek out the mysteries, I would love for that to be a viable path. But I also think that I'm somewhat isolated in that opinion, because a lot of people still don't want their wives to become members of their own lodge and things like that, which then I would just make the rule that like you can't have a spouse in your lodge, and that's it. But I want Masonry to keep growing. I think in 20 or 30 years Masonry will keep growing if dictatorships and tyranny doesn't prevail, and then I think that people should still consider joining Freemasonry, young men especially, consider joining Freemasonry, because you need a sacred third place, between the home and between work and school. I think that you need something that is going to be that sacred third place. And a lot of us, especially in America, where we are not, even though a lot of us are raised in Christian homes, we don't it's a lot of pageantry. It's not real faith most of the time. It's usually just something, you go to church because your mom told you to, kind of a thing. And so I think that we need this sacred third thing. Nowadays we don't really have rites of passage for men transitioning from boyhood or from adolescence into manhood. And so I think that even just on the most mundane, basic level, stripped of all spiritual stuff, Masonry provides young men especially with a framework to be able to lead better, happier, and healthier lives, to be a better spouse, to be a better father, to be a better mentor, to be a better community member. And so Masonry and fraternalism, I think, needs to make a comeback in order for society to get better, so we can prevent tyrants. I think that if Masonry was to grow in 20 to 30 years, it would almost guarantee that there would be less of an opportunity for the tyrants to really take over. And so I do hope that that's ultimately the fate of Masonry in the next 20 to 30 years.
I agree that, again, I'm not a Freemason, but I agree that it can help men. Freemasonry, I believe it can be an organization that can help boys become men for sure. And some Freemasons who have children send them to demolish schools, and then they become Freemasons from there. And I believe that's a privileged position. But I will touch on something that you said there about membership. Again, I'm not a Freemason, but if I were a Freemason, I'm just giving my unsolicited opinion here. I believe it should be okay for anybody to be able to join a Masonic lodge, but mixing men with women, I don't know if that's a good idea, to be honest, because you can just contemplate how many problems can arise from that. And it will be strange, especially if your wife is not a Freemason and you as a man go to a Masonic lodge where there are also women. I don't know. There can be a lot of things that can go wrong there. So I don't know if it's a good idea, essentially. Anyway, I'm more of a traditionalist. For me, I share some progressive ideas, but I'm more of a traditionalist myself. So again, this is just my unsolicited opinion. I'm not a member of Freemasons, so I can't say, from a position of authority how things should be. It's just a thought that I had. So
that's why I like both. I like that clandestine lodges exist because that's great for them, and then I like that regular lodges exist because that's also great for them. If they both serve a purpose. They both should be allowed to exist. I just kind of wish that some brothers weren't so offended or triggered by the fact that clandestine lodges exist. And also, I wouldn't mind giving them their flowers and saying hey, I would still like to call you a brother, even if you're from an irregular or clandestine lodge, because in this day and age, we're the minority. Initiates are the minority. So really doesn't matter where you're from or what you do. I'm just hey, the fact that you're doing something, you're already in the bottom 1 or 3% of people.
I think Freemasons the regulars should also understand why these people became clandestine in the first place. I think they should look at that first of all, because there will be some important answers there. So anyway, Mike, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it. The vibes were amazing. You offered a lot of information, a lot of depth. You are a wonderful person. And for the people who want to, follow you or maybe look into your work, where can they find you and what are you currently working on? What interesting projects are you doing? Because I know you're lecturing at the Philosophical Research Society, which was founded by Manly Palmer Hall. So this is your moment to shine.
Plug myself. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
So if anybody likes my content or my videos or anything like that, I'm on Instagram and TikTok as Magic with a K, MAGICK, Mike 077. And so numerological significance there. So Magic Mike 77 or 077. And then also I have a occult store that I am currently creating and building. We're e-commerce right now, but eventually I'm going to open up a physical store here in Fullerton called Sacred Traditions. So if anybody's interested in incense, ritual tools, statuary, botanicals, candles, all that stuff, athames, wands, whatever, they can go to my website at magicmike.com, and under the Sacred Traditions tab, you can have my store. I got all kinds of stuff. I also got some cool esoteric shirts and stuff that I think are pretty fun and pretty funny. So I have those up there. And then for those who are interested in much, much deeper dives, I have a Substack called the Magic Mike Substack. And so if they were just look me up under Magic Mike, again with a K at the end of Magic, then they'll easily be able to find me. I have I have quite a few articles on all different, and it's essentially a blog. One thing I do throw out there is I'm not an adept. I'm still very much just a seeker on the path. I still have quite a ways to go in order to reach adepthood. But while I'm on this path, because it is such a unique and rare thing for people to talk about these things, I essentially have decided to make my Substack like a blog, essentially, where I post my experiences and my opinions on things, which have already changed since when I first started the Substack. So it's ever growing, it's ever evolving. It definitely keeps with the ethos of the seeker.
Perfect. That's what a real alchemist will say. Okay,
I
Mike.
hope so.
Next episode is almost guaranteed. So if you guys have any questions for him, drop them in the comments below. And we're going to see Mike in the next episode. Hopefully we can discuss Jeffrey Epstein. We can discuss the symbolism of the temple, the archons. We didn't get into that. The children of Lamech, I want to ask you about that as well, is on the list. So we'll get into all of these interesting things. Thank you guys for watching. And see you.